Chapter 472. Only a few pieces of snow remained on the pavilion on the other side of the lake. They were warmly and thinly divided into countless white pieces. It was as if many patches had been added to the dark pavilion. The snow in Jingdo stopped on the 29th of the 12th lunar month. Within 3 days, the servants in King Jing's manor had long swept all the snow from the grass on this side of the lake. However, the weather was cold, so there were no fresh and tender blades of grass on the grass. There were only white grass that had stiffened after death. Yet, no one took care of it. It appeared rather desolate. Fan Xian followed quietly behind King Jing. They walked into the depths of the garden, but his gaze lingered on King Jing's slightly hunched back. After entering the manor, Minister Fan came out and blocked King Jing's offensive of dirty words. It was lively for a while, but before he even saw Wuxia and Hongcheng, King Jing suddenly suggested that Fan Xian follow him for a walk. Although Fan Xian wasn't sure what the king's intention was with this suggestion, seeing his father secretly nod his head, he let him go. Along the way, there wasn't much scenery in the garden. Even the vegetable fields that King Jing served day and night were just a few pools of mud. King Jing walked in front and didn't speak, so Fan Xian could only follow in silence. As he examined the king's back, his thoughts had long floated elsewhere. This king was not normal. The history books had seen this kind of self-restrained and even self-defiling absurd kings. However, it was rare to see a noble like King Jing who did it so straightforwardly and truly had no desire for power. Particularly with his old appearance, no one knew what kind of mental blow he had experienced in the past. The two of them stopped by the vegetable fields. King Jing said in a raspy voice, "The first time I saw you, it was in this vegetable garden." Fan Xian thought of that poetry gathering and how he was always a guest in the sorrowful autumn. He thought of how his mind had been filled with lewdness at the time of seeing a smiling white-clothed woman in the vegetable field and then seeing a farmer. He couldn't resist laughing and replied, "You always like to tease the younger generation." "I'm not the only one who grows vegetables in the capital," King Jing said. Fan Xian was startled, thinking that this was not nonsense. Although Jingdo was wealthy, there were still many poor commoners. It was common for these commoners to grow vegetables under the walls of their courtyards to supplement their daily diet. But since King Jing had said so, he naturally had his reasons, so Fan Xian listened quietly. "That old guy from the Qin family also likes to grow vegetables, but he only grows cabbages and carrots." King Jing said with a hint of mockery, "Soldiers only know how to fill their stomachs. They don't know that growing vegetables is also an art." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He carefully thought over the prince's words and didn't know how to respond for a moment. King Jing walked into the muddy vegetable field and put his hands on his waist. He looked at the desolate scenery around him. After a moment of silence, he said, "Have you found out who did the attack in the valley?" Fan Xian closed his mouth tightly. Of course, he knew that the attack in the valley had been single-handedly arranged by the old killing god of the military, the old Qin master. The problem was, this was presently Qin Kingdom's biggest secret. Other than Chen Pingping and himself, presumably not many people knew. King Jing had first talked about the old Qin master growing vegetables and now he was talking about the attack in the valley. Was he hinting at something? But, King Jing often did not ask about political affairs and did not have any deep connections with the civil and military officials of the court. What right did he have to say that the attack in the valley was done by the old Qin family? However, King Jing did not say anything, so Fan Xian did not know if his guess was correct. Furthermore, he could not tell the other party about the Qin family because it involved the deepest of secrets. He could only smile bitterly and say, "The court has been investigating this entire time, and the council is also investigating. We only know that it has something to do with the military. However, the witness is already dead. There are no clues at all." King Jing turned his head to glance at him as if surprised by his indifference. He thought that the kid did not understand his meaning. He huffed angrily and said, "Idiot." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and thought to himself, in this kind of matter, couldn't he pretend to be stupid? The city guarding crossbow is the Yi family's. King Jing stared into Fan Xian's eyes. But, don't forget about the Qin family. The prince's words were too direct. Fan Xian couldn't pretend anymore even if he wanted to. Other than the suspicion in his heart, he was also particularly moved. This old man was too good to him. He furrowed his brows and said, "I have no enmity with the Qin family." The prince huffed and didn't continue to say anything. Lifting his feet, he walked out of the mud vegetable patch and headed deeper into the garden. Fan Xian looked at his back and vaguely guessed something. The reason the prince dared to guess that the Qin family would act was certainly because of what happened back then. However, the connection between the Qin family and the Taiping courtyard murder case was a secret that even his father did not know. Even Chen Pingping had only found out after a dozen years of investigation. How did the prince know? Thinking of this, hot blood surged in Fan Xian's heart. He didn't care anymore. He caught up and grabbed King Jing's sleeve. King Jing started and slowly turned his head. Fan Xian looked at him and said sincerely, "What exactly happened back then? Why did no one under heaven know that the Qin family was involved? Why was this matter not brought to light when Jingdo bled that night?" "You ask too many questions," King Jing sighed and said. "Although I'm just an idle king who doesn't do proper work, you have to remember that I'm still a member of the royal family. As for why I know what the two old fellows behind you don't know, the reason is very simple. It's because I was still young back then, and I was still with my mother." The corners of the prince's brows twitched. He revealed a mischievous smile. "I was young and always liked to hide and seek everywhere. So, sometimes it was easy to overhear things. As for what I overheard, no one else knows in all these years." Fan Xian forced a smile and stopped. The prince's willingness to point out the Qin family was already a sign of unusual love for him. However, if that matter involved the Empress Dowager, who was the prince's own mother, how could he continue? Yunrui was young at the time. This matter had nothing to do with her. King Jing was silent for a moment and then suddenly said, "I still want to make this clear to you. You followed Fan Jian and the Overwatch Council since you were young and learned a lot. However, there are many things that have also become laughable." At this moment, the old and the young stood on the cold ridge of the field. Not far away was the wall of King Jing's manor. Outside the wall was the unchanging and bleak sky of Jingdo. Fan Xian listened to the prince's words beside him and felt incomparably warm in his heart. What matter? Regardless of whether it is Chen Pingping, that old dog, or your father, they are both masters of scheming. Thus, they always like to make things very complicated. Most importantly, they don't trust anyone, and the one they trust the least is each other. King Jing smiled coldly. This is the stupidest thing. Chen Pingping even suspected Yunrui in the past. He didn't think about how old Yunrui was at that time. Fan Xian forced a smile. The mutual suspicion and wariness between his father and Chen Pingping had existed ever since his mother's death and had grown deeper and deeper. It had only improved after he had entered the capital. "I've swallowed the matter of the old Qin family for so long. Today, I'm telling you not for you to take revenge," King Jing said calmly. King Jing calmly said, "I just feel that you have offended the military enough. Our Qin kingdom has always been founded on the military. If you don't know who your true enemy in the military is, I am worried that you will die casually." King Jing said the words, "casually," very seriously. He didn't want anyone else to die casually like this anymore. Fan Xian bowed to the ground and then straightened his body. He asked the question he cared about the most. "Sir, why are you so good to me?" Hearing these words, King Jing suddenly froze. After a long time, he suddenly laughed. His laughter grew louder and louder, sharper and more mournful. He laughed until his stomach hurt. He squatted on the ridge of the field and held his abdomen, unable to raise his head for a moment. Fan Xian's mind was in a mess. He stood woodenly to the side and looked at the prince beside him. He looked at the white hair on his head that did not match his actual age fluttering in the cold wind. He looked at the tears squeezed out of the corners of his eyes because of his smile. After a long time, King Jing straightened his body and furrowed his brows in thought. He then said, "I also don't know." He then walked down the ridge of the field. Fan Xian continued to follow silently behind him. "The emperor and I were both raised by my mother," King Jing said calmly. His face had long recovered its usual weathered calmness. At that time, King Cheng's manner was not very eye-catching. It didn't have much status in Jingdo, so my brother and I could still play around. Your father followed us every day. Additionally, there was Chen Pingping, the study companion that the palace had invited. The four of us mingled together every day. I was the youngest, so I was the most bullied. Later, my brother and Chen Pingping went to my mother's old home in Danzhou to play. After they came back, they happily said that they had met an interesting girl there. King Jing smiled. Not long after, that girl arrived in Jingdo and found King Cheng's manor. Fan Xian also smiled. That was my mother. Yes. King Jing leisurely thought about the past. I remember when I was young, I pestered your mother every day to play. Yes, at the time, I called her sister Yezi. Your mother loved me very much, so my brother could not let Chen Pingping bully me anymore. This was very good. The old and the young talked as they walked. In a moment, they had arrived outside a study. Although Fan Xian wanted to listen more to King Jing talk about the past, he still put his attention on the study because it was clear that few people came to this study. King Jing liked to grow vegetables and did not like to read. King Jing pushed open the door and entered. In a raspy voice, he said, "Sit." Fan Xian did not brush away the dust on the seat and sat down calmly. King Jing rummaged through the bookcase for a while and finally found a thick book. He handed it to Fan Xian and said, "Read." Fan Xian accepted it with both hands. He glanced at the cover and saw that it was a book on agronomy. He couldn't help glancing at King Jing gloomily. King Jing was silent for a moment and then said, "Concerning your mother, I don't have much to say. You asked me why I was so good to you. Actually, that's not right. I wasn't good enough to you. At least, I was kept in the dark by them for almost 20 years. King Jing slowly walked out of the study and faced Fan Xian with his slightly slumped back. His voice was slightly dispirited. I always thought she had no descendants. Fan Xian sat on the dusty chair and casually flipped through the thick book on agronomy. In his heart, he was thinking about what King Jing had said earlier. In reality, he could faintly capture King Jing's thoughts. It was a touch of youth and bitterness that could not be verbalized, but a thought that he remembered for a lifetime. When a young man was just beginning to grow and there was a gentle, beautiful, all-powerful, and all-accepting sister by his side, it was hard to avoid a story like this happening. When he had been reborn into this world, he was already a mature soul. In his previous life, how could he not have had such an experience? Which man had not had such an experience? However, for normal people, after they grew up, there would always be truly sweet fruits that would fill in their spiritual world. King Jing's normal experience of growing up was clearly interrupted by the great history of the Qin kingdom. The Yi family was destroyed overnight, but King Jing could not be angry and had nowhere to be angry. Thus, his hair turned gray early, and his figure was slightly slender. He only respected the fields and not the palace. Fan Xian's fingers flipped through the slightly yellow pages of the book. Suddenly, his fingers froze. He saw a few thin pieces of paper stuck in the thick book. His heart jumped. He quickly flipped through the book and found a few more thin pieces of paper. The handwriting on the paper was strange and yet familiar. The writer's brush was clearly not good enough. The strokes were straight and stiff, like a matchstick building block. The contents of the paper were not out of Fan Xian's expectations. It recorded some suggestions from someone to someone else, such as the Overwatch Council and the matter of merchants. There were also a few notes about what they wanted to eat that day and where they planned to play the next day. Fan Xian smiled and said to himself as he looked at the pieces of paper, "The other things you wrote have probably all been burned by the people of this world. Who would have thought that the little boy from back then would still have a few left behind?" He tilted his head and said, "However, your handwriting really isn't as good as mine. Furthermore, your strength is focused on the big parts and not the small parts. If you're not used to using a brush, then use a goose feather." "Oh, right, I opened a small workshop in the palace treasury that specializes in making pencils. In these things, I'm much smarter than you." After a moment of silence, Fan Xian thought about it and put the pieces of paper into his clothes. Presumably, King Jing also needed this kind of relief. He stood up with a peaceful smile on his face and walked out of the study. King Jing was not outside the study. Fan Xian had come to this manor many times and did not need a serving girl to lead the way. With his hands behind his back, he swayed and swayed until he arrived outside a row of large rooms. This row of rooms formed an independent little courtyard. On the courtyard door hung a large copper lock. Fan Xian looked at this lock and couldn't resist smiling. Walking up the steps, he knocked heavily on the door and yelled, "If you don't open the door, I'm leaving. Don't go. Don't go." A series of urgent shouts came from the courtyard. Someone quickly ran over. The large wooden door made a thud. That person must have hit the door. From this, one could imagine the person's urgency. The door opened a small crack. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked in. He couldn't help but jump in fright. He found that there was also an eye looking out from the other side. There were clearly a few patches of eye wax at the corners of the person's eyes. His hair was messy, and he looked extremely haggard. "Damn it!" Fan Xian spat. "You're the ghost." Locked in the room, Crown Prince Jing, Li Hongqing, let loose a torrent of abuse. "Hurry up and fish me out." Fan Xian saw that he was truly pitiful and couldn't help but sigh. However, before he could finish sighing, he laughed again and scolded, "His Highness locked you up. How am I supposed to fish you out? Go plead for mercy for the old man." Li Hongqing was about to go crazy from being locked up. It wasn't easy to see someone who wasn't afraid of his father. How could he let it go? He scolded, "You kid, do you have any conscience? You tricked me, you slandered me, you used filthy words to spray me. I accepted it all, but I've been locked up for so long. Don't you have any sympathy? Remember when you first came to Jingdo, did I treat you badly? I took you to the brothel, I let you pick up girls." Fan Xian plugged his ears and listened to Li Hongqing's continuous scolding. He knew that this guy was truly too wretched. He smiled bitterly and said, "His Highness locked you up for your own good. Otherwise, if you went out and messed around with those brothers again, in the end, it wouldn't necessarily end well for you. If I die, then I die." Li Hongqing laughed coldly. "It's better than being suffocated to death." Fan Xian took a few steps back and looked at the layout of the courtyard. He couldn't help but say, dumbfounded, "Heavens, it can't be, you've been locked up in this courtyard, for a year, right?" Li Hongqing was startled and scolded, "Then I would have gone crazy a long time ago. Usually, I'm just not allowed out of the manor. Although it's all prison, the manor's prison is always a bit bigger." Fan Xian rubbed his nose and nodded his head in admiration. With the manor as a prison, the heart cannot be free. The crown prince's words are indeed philosophical. Li Hongqing sighed sorrowfully. Don't provoke me any more. Originally, it was good for me to stay in the manor and listen to the drama. In the end, as soon as you returned to the capital, you were assassinated. Then, you went to kill people. My old man didn't say anything and immediately locked me back in the little courtyard. Tell me, who did I offend? Fan Xian looked at Li Hongqing's pitiful appearance through the crack in the door. He couldn't help but feel sympathy and remorse in his heart. He knew why King Jing's manner was like this. It was because King Jing didn't want his son to be involved in those matters. As soon as he returned to the capital, he made a big move against the second prince's faction. If Li Hongqing was still tied to the second prince, who knew how he would deal with him? All right. Fan Xian looked around and saw that there was no one around. In a small voice, he said, I'll get you out and take you to have fun. But, you have to promise me that you won't go see those people. Li Hongqing was overjoyed and nodded repeatedly. He only said with suspicion, don't break this lock. If I want to escape, I don't know how to fight my way out. Fan Xian took out a key from his belt and mockingly said, don't forget, I came from the Overwatch Council. The large copper lock opened with a click. King Jing's crown prince, Li Hongqing, who had been locked in the little courtyard without seeing the light of day, finally saw the light of day. He took large steps out and looked at the open surroundings. He took a deep breath and patted Fan Xian's shoulder heavily. At least you still remember old times. In reality, with such a big commotion, how could the servants in the manor not know? However, since the person in charge was Sir Fan Jr. and the person they were saving was their own crown prince, no one dared to stop him. Right at this moment, a clear and bright voice that was slightly anxious and fearful suddenly resounded. Brother! Why did you run out on your own? Not far to the left of the stone steps stood a young noble lady wearing an apricot red robe. Her little face was red with anxiety. Be careful, father will beat you to death. Fan Xian turned his head in surprise and looked at the young lady. He saw that she still had that weak and meek appearance. However, there was more elegance and grace between her brows than in the past. He couldn't help but feel shocked. It had only been a year since he had seen her. How had the little girl become such a pure and lovely young lady? The young lady also saw Fan Xian's face clearly and was shocked. She covered her mouth. After the pleasant surprise in her eyes, she suddenly seemed to think of something. Immediately, a thread of mist formed in her eyes and she looked like she was about to cry. Fan Xian's heart was filled with fear. If one had to say who he was most afraid of in Jingdo, other than the emperor in the palace, it would be this young lady in front of him who had deep feelings for him. He remembered that when she was young, she clung to his side every day. Fortunately, the dust had long settled. He was her cousin. His heart relaxed a great deal. However, suddenly seeing the young lady's sad appearance, his heart also felt a bit uncomfortable. The young lady finally calmed her emotions. She walked in front of Fan Xian and bowed slightly. Using a mosquito-like voice, she said, Greetings, Brother Xian. Chapter 473. Fan Xian looked at the girl and wanted to run. Tugging on Hongqing's sleeve, he prepared to play with the two of them over the wall. Unexpectedly, a servant came out of nowhere and bowed to the two of them with a pained expression. Crown Prince, the king knows you've come out and wants you to see him. Hearing these words, Crown Prince Li Hongqing sucked in a cold breath. He was extremely vexed and regretful, but there was nothing he could do. He went first. Before he left, he glanced at Fan Xian and laughed bitterly. The emotions in his heart were indescribably complicated. Fan Xian understood that this crown prince still held a grudge against him for breaking up his marriage with Ruoruo. However, he couldn't do anything about it, so he could only shake his head. Outside the courtyard, there were only him and Wuxia left on the stone steps. Fan Xian knew he couldn't run anymore and smiled warmly. Looking at Hongqing's figure, he said, "Your brother used to be such a refined noble young master. How did he become like this?" Seeing him open his mouth to speak to her, Wuxia's little face was filled with uncontrollable joy. She stammered, "Locked up, for too long, scolding people every day, more and more like father." Fan Xian was startled and thought that it was true. Looking at the crown prince through the crack in the door, he didn't look down on him, but he saw that he was different from other people in power. This kind of character was naturally inherited from King Jing. In the so-called struggle, one could win or lose. This was the correct way. He made a hand gesture, inviting the princess to go first. Wuxia pulled at the skirt under her large red coat and lowered her head shyly as she walked slowly in front. Fan Xian followed behind her. As he walked, he examined the girl who was gradually spitting out her stamen. Looking at the soft strands of hair on her temples in the wind, his heart moved slightly. "Sister Wuxia, has anything new happened in the girls' school recently?" "Brother Xian, nothing." "Sister Wuxia, Brother Xian," the two of them chatted. Sister Wuxia's Brother Xian came more and more smoothly. The little girl's Brother Xian never stopped. Like this, they slowly walked toward the front of the manor. Along the way, they passed the cold garden, the cold path, the pavilions covered in snow, and the artificial hills covered in water. Princess Wuxia walked with her head down and replied in a low voice. She couldn't resist glancing back from time to time and then turning her head as if in shock. Fan Xian sighed in his heart and quickened his steps. He walked to her side and stood shoulder to shoulder with her. Princess Wuxia sensed the presence of the young man beside her and was startled. Her entire walking posture stiffened, and her fingers gripped her skirt tighter. Fan Xian smiled and said, "This world is truly strange. At the time, who would have thought that you were my cousin? Calling me Brother Xian is quite appropriate." As soon as these words came out, Princess Wuxia panicked. Her small face flushed red. She didn't say anything else and just remained silent. This pair of cousins knew very well what Fan Xian meant by these words. It was written clearly in the Qing law. Given their relationship, regardless of whether or not Fan Xian had such intentions, it was still impossible. Ever since Princess Wuxia saw Fan Xian for the first time when she was 12, her young girl's thoughts had all been placed on him. Regardless of whether it was under the grape trellises in the manor, in the autumn grass garden in the Fan Manor, or in the courtyard in the Tsang Mountains, she always liked to look at Fan Xian. The feelings of a young girl had not faded even after Fan Xian's marriage. Although she didn't dare ask her father, she always held on to the possibility of having 2 wives in the future. Who would have thought that such a big piece of news would explode in Jingdo one day? Brother Xian was her own cousin. From that day on, Wuxia knew this matter was impossible. However, how could 2 years of feelings fade in one day? After seeing her favorite Brother Xian, she panicked again. Hearing Fan Xian say these words, she knew he was reminding her. However, Princess Wuxia was, after all, only a 14-year-old girl. Hearing Fan Xian's gentle yet serious reminder, she did not turn her head and glare at him with hidden bitterness like other noble girls in Jingdo, nor did she huff coldly. She only lowered her head even more and refused to speak. A crystal-clear teardrop fell from her long eyelashes and landed on the stone floor by her feet. Fan Xian was dumbfounded. Seeing a girl cry, he didn't know what to do. Wuxia walked forward again. Fan Xian quickly followed behind her. Along the way, Wuxia lowered her head and cried. She stubbornly bit her lip and refused to make any sound. Fan Xian felt pity, love, and anger. He was unsure of how to explain when he suddenly realized that Wuxia had stopped in her steps and turned her head to look at him seriously. Fan Xian smiled and stretched out a finger to wipe away the teardrop on the girl's face. Wuxia was still as gentle as before. She stared fixedly at Fan Xian and stammered, "Brother Xian, I beg of you something." "What is it?" "As long as I can do it," Fan Xian said seriously. "I know, it was you who thought of a way to break up Sister Ruoruo and brother's marriage." Wuxia lowered her head. Her fingers played with her skirt until countless troublesome wrinkles appeared on a corner of the light pink skirt. Fan Xian was startled. He hadn't thought that this girl would see this matter so clearly. "What is it?" Wuxia bowed slowly and said in a small voice that still retained her childish voice, "In the future, the palace will certainly appoint a marriage for Wuxia. If Wuxia is not willing, then I will have to trouble you." The marriages between the nobles in Jingdo involved too many political transactions. Fan Xian's marriage and Ruoruo's unfinished marriage were all like this. Given Princess Wuxia's status, her marriage was naturally arranged by the nobles in the palace and even personally by the Empress Dowager. Fan Xian opened his mouth wide. A moment later, he nodded his head dejectedly. He knew that he had once again been forced to carry an extremely heavy burden. The way of the world was indeed a little strange. Everyone else was matchmaking, but only he had become an expert in breaking up marriages. After Wuxia said this, she saw him nod his head again. It was as if she had used up all of the courage she had mustered earlier. Immediately, she became sad again. She looked at him deeply, turned her head, picked up her skirt, and walked quickly toward the front of the manor, no longer paying attention to Fan Xian. Fan Xian rubbed the back of his head as he watched Princess Wuxia's figure. He watched as she lowered her head and continued to cry silently. The feeling in his heart was truly not good. He thought to himself that this girl was truly each more troublesome than the last. In the long corridor behind Taiji Palace in the royal palace, facing the tall palace walls in the distance and the winter trees at the foot of the walls. The palace was heavily guarded, particularly near the inner palace. It was strictly forbidden for anyone to make noise, and it was even more impossible for anyone to do anything too impudent. However, when the serving girls and eunuchs moving about saw the young official stretching lazily and doing leg exercises in the long corridor, not a single person dared to go up and scold him. No one dared to remind him of anything. It was impossible for a young official to enter the inner palace. If there was, then there was only one person. Only he dared to be so free and at ease in the royal palace. In the long corridor, the young official pulled back his leg from the large pillar and turned his head to look at the awkward middle-aged eunuch who wanted to laugh but didn't dare. He scolded, "What are you laughing for? This palace is so big. Naturally, my legs will be sore. I don't know how you guys have such good leg skills." This young official was Fan Xian. The matter of him being the emperor's illegitimate child was known to everyone under heaven. Additionally, these years, he had been favored by the emperor to the extreme. His relationship with the various nobles and eunuchs in the palace was also harmonious. He had once spent a month in the palace recovering from his injuries, so the serving girls and eunuchs were all used to his presence in the palace. Only he would have the daring to do radio calisthenics in the inner palace. Today, he was accompanying Wanner back to her mother's palace. As soon as they entered the palace, Wanner was kept by the Empress Dowager's side. She refused to let her go. She said she wanted to keep her favorite granddaughter for the night. Fan Xian had no choice. He could only bring all kinds of gifts and walk toward the various palaces. After returning to the capital, he had walked through one. Now, he had to walk through another. It was truly boring, so he took a break and rested his feet in the long corridor behind Taiji Palace. The eunuch accompanying him, holding a large pile of gift boxes, was Eunuch Dai. Hearing Fan Xian scold him, he was not shocked. On the contrary, he was happy. He laughed and said, "Sir Fan Jr. is a 9th level ace. How can servants like us compare?" In the past, Eunuch Dai had also been greatly favored by the emperor. Although he was a member of Lady Shu's palace and was in charge of the important tasks of announcing edicts to various manors, because of his relationship with his nephew and because he was involved in the struggle between Fan Xian and the second prince, he was given an idle position. Later, because of the assassination attempt in the Hanging Temple, he was forced into a corner. If he had wasted another 2 years, he would probably have died without a straw mat to cover his body with. It was all thanks to Fan Xian's endless good words on his behalf that the emperor remembered how well he had served the emperor in the past. Only then did he spare his life and let him return to the inner palace to do some idle work. For Eunuch Dai, Fan Xian was his savior and even half his master. He was even more important than Lady Shu. How could he not serve him well? The boots under Fan Xian's feet were hot. He didn't even pull them all up. Just like that, he dragged them toward the end of the long corridor. Eunuch Dai glanced at his feet and said awkwardly, "Sir, it's better to be particular in the palace." Fan Xian glanced at him and was about to tease him a bit more when he suddenly saw a few eunuchs coming from the end of the corridor. The one at the front was young and had a familiar appearance. His face was raised very high, and he had an air of arrogance about him. The eunuchs behind him followed with their bodies half bent. They looked like servants of servants. "It's Eunuch Hong," Eunuch Dai reminded from behind Fan Xian. Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly and didn't say anything. He directly went forward. The two of them met in the middle of the corridor. Fan Xian clearly saw the few pimples on the arrogant young eunuch's face. He didn't say anything. He stood where he was and looked coldly at the other party. Hongzhu paused. He knew that Fan Xian was waiting for him to bow to him. However, he was now the head eunuch in the Eastern Palace. Furthermore, the emperor would occasionally have him go to the royal study to help out. It was even more impressive than when he held books in the royal study. Who in the palace would not respect him? Even when the court entered the palace, they were polite to him. Other than Shu the scholar, there was no official who dared to wait for him to bow first. He knew Fan Xian and knew that Fan Xian was not a normal official. Looking at Fan Xian's cold and disdainful expression, his face flushed red. He refused to lower his head first. The two of them were locked in a stalemate. The 3 or 4 eunuchs following Hongzhu were too low in rank and had never seen Fan Xian's face. How could they know that this young official was the powerful Sir Fan Jr.? Looking at this scene, they anxiously stood up for Eunuch Hong. In a sharp voice, they said, "Sir, why are you wandering around in the restricted palace?" Eunuch Dai hid behind Fan Xian and snickered. He had long lost the position he once had. In the palace, he was bullied badly by Hongzhu and the others. Seeing that these idiots were going to offend Fan Xian, he was unspeakably happy. He was about to say something when Fan Xian waved his hand to stop him. Fan Xian smiled slightly and looked at the eunuchs behind Hongzhu. Amused, he said, "You haven't been in the palace for long, right? There aren't many people in the palace who don't recognize me. I'm not wandering around. I'm just going to Shufang Palace to see the emperor." Indeed, it was a few eunuchs who hadn't been in the palace for long. They didn't understand the meaning in these words. They straightened their necks and said, "How dare you? Where is Shufang Palace? Why are you stopping in this long corridor? Be careful that Eunuch Hong calls the guards to throw you out." He was helping his master build up his reputation, but he had no idea that he was causing trouble for his master. As expected, Hongzhu saw the smile on Fan Xian's face become gentler and gentler. His own expression immediately changed. He was shocked, afraid, and angry. He turned his head and harshly scolded the eunuchs. Only then did he slowly bow to Fan Xian and say, "Greetings, Sir Fan Jr." Once the words, "Sir Fan Jr." came out, the eunuchs immediately knew they were finished. They looked at Fan Xian with faces full of fear and quickly knelt down to beg for mercy. Fan Xian couldn't be bothered to look at the eunuchs. He only stared at Hong Zhu's face and mockingly said, "My father is Minister Fan, so people call me Sir Fan Jr. What kind of eunuch Hong are you, a servant?" If Eunuch Hong knew these words, he would carefully skin you. Hong Zhu's face was full of fear and ruthlessness. He stared hatefully at Fan Xian and didn't say a word. "Slap yourself," Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said. Hong Zhu gritted his teeth and said, "I am a person of the Eastern Palace. Sir Fan Jr. is a court official. No matter what, you can't control the palace, right?" Fan Xian didn't say anything. He only looked at him coldly. Forced by those two gazes, Hong Zhu had no choice but to gently slap himself in the face. After this slap landed, Eunuch Dai, who was behind Fan Xian, was overjoyed. He was going to advertise it in the royal palace that night. The eunuchs behind Hong Zhu were scared half to death. They all knew of Eunuch Hong's position in the palace. They had no idea that with just one word from Sir Fan Jr., Eunuch Hong could only slap himself in the face. It looked like this Eunuch Hong was indeed not as powerful as Sir Fan Jr. Fan Xian moved his body to the side and blocked Eunuch Dai's line of sight. Taking advantage of the eunuchs kneeling on the ground, he gave Hong Zhu a meaningful glance. Hong Zhu saw it clearly, but his eyes were crying out, indicating that he was unable to find a convenient place to talk. Fan Xian nodded and coldly said, "Get out." Thus, Hong Zhu shook out his sleeve and, angry and embarrassed, led the eunuchs toward the other end of the long corridor. Seeing this, Eunuch Dai smiled charmingly at Fan Xian and said, "Let this dog of a servant continue to be arrogant. Just because the emperor and empress both like him, he can do whatever he wants in the palace." Fan Xian smiled and said, "It is indeed not good to do whatever I want in the palace. In a moment, when I go to Xiaofan Palace, I still have to pay attention to my appearance." Chapter 474. In Xiaofan Palace, Yi Guipin was beaming with joy as she watched the two people at the desk. Fan Xian was watching Li Qingping copy a book. Not many people in the palace cared about the contents of the book. The key was in the word watch, and the key was in the teacher-student relationship between Fan Xian and Li Qingping. Yi Guipin was not a shrewd and calculative noblewoman. On the contrary, in this dark and gloomy royal palace, she had always maintained the carefree and open-mindedness of a virgin. Because of her purity and truth, she was favored by the emperor and gave birth to the third prince. Given the Qing emperor's style of not caring about the matters between men and women, after the empress gave birth to the crown prince, he probably had no plans to have more children. From this, it could be seen that Yi Guipin's personality had indeed suited the emperor's personality. Even the other people in the palace were the same. They always felt that this Guipin from the Liu family was full of energy all day, charming and lively, and made people feel comfortable just by looking at her. Like Lady Ning in the courtyard, they were both different in the royal palace. However, this difference of hers was more likable. Even though the Empress Dowager had never been very close to the third prince because of the power of the Liu family and the Fan family, she did not have any malicious words toward Yi Guipin. Everyone knew that Yi Guipin was very lenient and treated people well. She never had any thoughts of harming others. This was the result of 10 years of silence in the palace. Just because she was unwilling to scheme and had no thoughts of harming others, it did not mean that Yi Guipin truly did not have her own plans. Otherwise, she would not have used the opportunity of Fan Xian saving the third prince to have the third prince take Fan Xian as his teacher and open up all of the resources in Xiaofan Palace to Fan Xian. She knew Fan Xian's importance to Xiaofan Palace, so she always tried to win him over when there was no one around. The royal family always kept a close eye on the extended relatives, but Fan Xian had a complicated identity between the relatives, the officials, and the royal family. When Shufang Palace interacted with Fan Xian, the people in the palace could not say much. The more stable Fan Xian's position in court was, the more stable Shufang Palace's position in the emperor's heart was. Occasionally, when she thought of Fan Xian's power and the emperor's favor, Yi Guipin would always feel a bit surprised. The emperor favored his illegitimate child too much. Because of Fan Xian's great favor, it was not that Yi Guipin had not been wary of certain dangers. However, that caution could not be expressed. Thus, she remained silent and maintained a hearty and flirtatious appearance. It was not until Fan Xian returned to the clan that she truly confirmed Fan Xian's intentions. Boundless gratitude welled up from the depths of her heart. Thus, at this moment, looking at the scene of Fan Xian and her son sitting side by side at the desk, she felt incomparably happy. I heard that you met someone in the hallway at the back of the palace. Yi Guipin's personal palace maid, Xinger, received a rumor from within the palace and hurriedly told her mistress. Yi Guipin's heart jumped. She gently beckoned Fan Xian to a side room and opened her eyes. Fan Xian rubbed his slightly sore fingers and said with a smile, "Hongzhu, that servant, is becoming more and more impudent. Seeing me, he doesn't bow. Even when he walks, he uses his nostrils to look at the road. I taught him a lesson on behalf of the emperor." Using his nostrils to look at the road, this description was amusing and mischievous. Yi Guipin couldn't resist laughing out loud. However, she immediately restrained her smile and quietly said, "Eunuch Hong is now a popular person in the palace and the head eunuch in the Eastern Palace. Furthermore, the emperor seems to favor him and is preparing to have him return to the royal study." She glanced at Fan Xian. Everyone in the palace had, through their own channels, clearly investigated Hongzhu's promotion and history. They all knew that Hongzhu was serving in the royal study. Just as he was about to climb up, it was Fan Xian's secret report that caused Hongzhu to lose his position and be chased to the Eastern Palace. Yi Guipin knew that Fan Xian and Hongzhu did not see eye to eye, but Hongzhu had already climbed up again in the Eastern Palace. The emperor seemed to be regretting his actions in the past. She had to remind Fan Xian that although he was not afraid of this kind of eunuch, as a foreign official, he had to be on guard against the eunuchs in the palace stirring up trouble. Fan Xian shook his head and smiled coldly. How can it be so easy for such a servant who allows his brother to forcefully take over the people's property to return to the royal study? She thought for a moment and then said in a soft voice, "Why bother with a servant? If he truly returns to the royal study, the hatred between the two sides will deepen. I'm afraid it will be inconvenient. Besides, there are rumors in the palace that this eunuch Hong is related to you. After all, your identity is a court official. Eunuchs in Qing Kingdom never had much status. Ever since the founding of the country, it had been strictly forbidden for eunuchs to interfere with government affairs. Light offenders would be expelled from the palace. Heavy offenders would be beaten to death on the spot. However, in the decades since the founding of the country, there had always been one or two exceptions. Old eunuch Hong, who was always resting outside Hanguang Palace, was such a special person. No one knew how many years this old eunuch had stayed in the palace. He was deeply trusted by the Empress Dowager and the Emperor. Furthermore, he was a mysterious and powerful figure. If Hongzhu was really related to old eunuch Hong, Fan Xian would probably be wary of him. However, Fan Xian knew the reason behind this and couldn't resist smiling. He could not tell Yi Guipin, so he could only smile and say, "Aunt, don't worry. I know what I'm doing." Yi Guipin saw that he did not care and couldn't resist saying a few more words of advice. Seeing that it had no effect, she angrily went into the back of the room, too lazy to continue talking to this stubborn child. Fan Xian moved closer to the third prince's table and said a few more words. He then left Shufang Palace under the third prince's reluctant gaze. Was going to stay the night in the Empress Dowager's Hanguang Palace. No one knew how many days she would stay. Fan Xian and his wife entered the palace, but only one of them had to go back. Walking through the long and gloomy doorway of the Gate of Divine Martial, he was alone. Looking at the blurry shadow behind him, he felt very unhappy. On one hand, he felt that Wan was indeed very favored in the royal family. On the other hand, he was silently cursing. That old woman only knew about the love between grandfather and granddaughter. She had never thought that he and his wife would be reunited after a long time. He walked out of the palace with a face full of displeasure. He saw the great prince looking at him with a not quite there smile. He couldn't help but say unhappily, since the founding of the country, there have not been many commanders of the imperial army and officials of the guards who have stood guard outside the royal palace every day like you. This is not the time for marching and fighting. This is a time of peace. Who are you waiting to see make a fool of yourself by standing guard outside the palace? The great prince's smile disappeared. He huffed coldly and said, "What joke do you have to see? Do you think Chen will lose face if she doesn't return with you? Don't forget, my sister grew up in the palace. You seem to have long forgotten this." After Fan Xian returned to the capital, he had seen the great prince a few times. However, there were always outsiders beside him, so it was difficult to speak of personal matters. Although the two brothers had long formed an alliance that did not need to be spoken of under Chen Pingping and Lady Ning's intimate care, the great prince's position was different. He was the elder brother of all the princes. He did not want to see the crown prince and the second prince be played step by Fan Xian until they became depressed. Thus, there was still some distance between the two of them. "I won't talk much with you today. I have to hurry back to the manor to do some business." Fan Xian looked at the great prince's expression and knew what this fierce general of the army and political virgin was about to say to him. He repeatedly waved his hand. The great prince scolded in a heavy voice, "I don't plan on lecturing you about Chen's matter today. However, what exactly are you going to do with that woman in the north?" Fan Xian was startled. Only now did he know that it was another family matter. He couldn't help smiling bitterly and saying, "I say, Your Highness, this is my family matter. Since Wan has married me, there is no need for you to worry about it." At the beginning, he had been slightly jealous of the intimacy between the great prince and Wan. Now that he had the opportunity, he coldly retaliated. The great prince was furious. He forcefully suppressed his anger and said, "Who has the patience to care about you? However, Wang Fei said that you still haven't come to my manor after the new year. She had me come to ask you if you aren't planning on coming." Wang Fei was the great princess of northern Qi that Fan Xian had personally escorted to the south. Fan Xian rubbed his head and said, "Naturally, I have to go to your manor. It will probably be the day after tomorrow." Seeing that he had agreed, the great prince nodded and didn't pay him any more attention. Fan Xian suddenly thought of something and said, "I'll also bring Hongcheng." The great prince was slightly surprised and glanced at him, thinking, "Wasn't Hongcheng grounded because of you?" Fan Xian didn't explain. He only furrowed his brows and said, "Speaking of which, do you still want that manor in Yangtsong Alley? She is a proper Hu tribe princess. You can't just leave her in that courtyard to rot, right?" The great prince choked and couldn't speak for a moment. Fan Xian looked at this scene and confirmed that when the Western Expedition Army was on their way back to the capital, this great prince must have had countless stories with the Hu tribe princess, Ma Suasua. However, it wasn't good to poke at him again. He raised his hands in a salute and climbed into the black carriage. After returning to the Fan Manor and entering the most secretive study in the triangular area of the garden, he confirmed that there were no eyes or ears around. Even the tiger guards and the servant the emperor had buried in the Fan Manor were far away from the study. Only then did Fan Xian spread his legs and lay comfortably on the low couch. He placed his feet, which were wearing pure wool socks produced by the palace treasury, toward the door of the study. He relaxed and let the steam rise, making his sore feet happy. The pair of boots was placed under the couch. The slip of paper was already in his hand. No one knew about his relationship with Hongzhu. Not even Chen Pingping and his father knew. Even Su Wenmao, who had personally handled the Yingzhou matter, did not know that he was avenging Hongzhu. He would not be able to guess in this direction. It could be said that Hongzhu was the deepest spy Fan Xian had buried in the royal palace. Because of this, the two sides did not dare to take the risk of establishing a regular intelligence system. It would be difficult for any news Hongzhu had to send out of the palace. Of course, the normal news in the royal palace was handled by a few eunuchs that Yi Guipin and Fan Xian were on good terms with, so there was no need to worry about ears and eyes being blocked. Since Hongzhu had taken the risk to send him news, then this news was worth paying attention to. Furthermore, the glimmer of fear he had seen when he entered the palace before the new year made Fan Xian even more curious about the contents of this slip of paper. Fan Xian looked at the slip of paper and involuntarily narrowed his eyes. When he read to the end, he could not suppress the shock in his heart and directly sat up on the couch. When he began to read this slip of paper, he did not think much of it. He felt that Hongzhu was taking too much of a risk. As he read to the end, he finally understood the meaning hidden in Hongzhu's words. He was so frightened that he could no longer lie down. What was written on the slip of paper was very simple. The specific names of the people were also used in a secret language that Fan Xian and Hongzhu had discussed at the beginning. Fan Xian understood it very well. The opening paragraph wrote about a strange habit the crown prince had when he went to bed. He always liked to lift up the clothes of the serving girls and concubines and cover their heads, only revealing their naked lower bodies. The handwriting of the second paragraph trembled slightly. It was clear that Hongzhu was also afraid when he wrote it. It said that in the year Fan Xian had left Jingdou, the crown prince's health had gradually improved. His venereal disease seemed to have been cured. However, his habit of going to bed had not changed. Furthermore, a few times when the crown prince was drunk, he could faintly hear him call out the word "aunt" in the moment of ecstasy. Aunt? Aunt. If it was only limited to these two paragraphs, Fan Xian could only use this intelligence report to confirm that the crown prince had endless fantasies about the eldest princess' beautiful appearance and perfect body. Although it was slightly perverted, for Fan Xian, who had experienced countless baptisms of sex in his previous life, it was nothing. What truly scared Fan Xian so much that he jumped up from the couch was the third paragraph in Hongzhu's message. There was only one sentence. He said that in these few months, the crown prince had rarely been close to the serving girls and concubines in the Eastern Palace. Furthermore, he was in good spirits. It was very simple. To a normal person, the last sentence was very meaningless, but it scared Fan Xian quite a bit. Although the words on this piece of paper were taboo, in the eyes of observant people, they would still know who it was talking about. Hongzhu must have seen something or heard something, but he didn't dare write it on the paper. Aunt? Fan Xian paced a few times in the study. His lips were a bit dry. Finally, he stopped in front of the low couch. Rubbing his hands together, he crushed the piece of paper into powder. His expression was very strange. After a long time, he cursed in a low voice, "Do you think you're Yanghua?" Fan Xian was dumbfounded. He was completely dumbfounded. Although Sir Jin and Sir Zhongma had both taught him that the two dirtiest places in the world were the royal palace and the brothel, and the history of his previous life had used the words "dirty Tang" and "stinky man" to give him some mental preparation. Now that he truly knew about the things in the palace, he, the owner of the largest brothel in Qing Kingdom, still couldn't help but stare dumbfounded and feel greatly shocked. He walked to the side of the table and picked up a cup of cold tea to drink, extinguishing the shock and sense of absurdity in his heart. With great difficulty, he finally calmed down. He finally knew where Hongzhu's fear came from. Anyone who knew of such an incestuous story that could not be told to the world, their first reaction would be to be afraid of being silenced. At the same time, he also knew why the Crown Prince had been so calm recently and appeared to have a card up his sleeve. It turned out that he had the confidence to make the eldest princess truly abandon the second prince and turn to support him. But, what if the eldest princess was playing with the Crown Prince's feelings? Fan Xian suddenly thought of this and immediately shook his head, giving himself a light slap. Such a big thing, what exactly was he thinking? Did he have to think for the second prince? He had to reap the most benefits from this information. However, he still couldn't help but think of the scene in Guangxin Palace. He involuntarily shivered. He was indeed uncomfortable in his heart. For one, he strangely felt that it was not worth it for the eldest princess. How could the foremost beauty in Qing Kingdom, a peerless beauty who had not shown any signs of her youth fading away, use her body as a weapon? Even though there had always been rumors in the streets that the eldest princess kept many handsome men, Fan Xian still unconsciously did not want to believe this. The second reason he was unhappy was that no matter what was said, the eldest princess was his mother-in-law. The Crown Prince, that little bastard, had an affair with his mother-in-law. What would happen to his father-in-law's hat in Wuzhou? What the f*ck was he? Fan Xian stood by the table with his fists tightly clenched. There was a wave of unreasonable anger in his heart. This was clearly a piece of news that he could use to make a big deal out of and directly bring down the Crown Prince. However, it did not make him happy at all. He kept feeling that he had been taken advantage of by the Crown Prince. At the same time, he was angry at Hongzhu's daring. He didn't know if the little eunuchs kneeling on the ground had seen a corner of the paper he had stepped on. If this matter got out, it would be difficult for Fan Xian to protect him. He was silent by the table for a long time. He finally shook off that absurd feeling of failure and anger. He took 2 deep breaths and decided to make good use of this shocking news. However, if he couldn't talk to Hongzhu face to face and act from inside the royal palace, it would be impossible to maximize the influence of this matter. After all, he couldn't have the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council go into the marketplace to spread rumors. The eldest princess had an affair with the Crown Prince? Fan Xian didn't want to risk the Emperor's anger or the Empress Dowager's embarrassment turning into anger and investigating the Overwatch Council to throw out these rumors. He had to have the Emperor or Empress Dowager personally discover this scandal in the palace. He made up his mind to make a good plan. At the same time, before he left the capital, he had to discuss all the details of the plan with Hongzhu and Fan Xian. When it came to plans and conspiracies, Fan Xian, who was skilled in assassination and little tricks, did not have much confidence. He immediately thought of his most capable assistant, the white-clothed young master. He immediately walked out of the study, passed through the back garden, and got into the carriage. He didn't even hear the sound of the edict being announced from the front yard of the Fan Manor. The carriage drove to the Overwatch Council's gray and black square building. Fan Xian hurriedly jumped off the carriage. His leather boots stepped on the remaining snow piled on either side of Tianhe Avenue with a whoosh. As he walked into the council, there were Overwatch Council officials he bumped into along the way who bowed with faces full of shock and made way. These officials looked at the commissioner's gloomy expression and hurried footsteps. They all wondered which major figure in the capital was going to be unlucky again. Pushing open the door and entering the secret room, he was not surprised to see a young official wearing thick, plain-colored clothing sitting behind the table beside the black cloth by the window. In the entire Overwatch Council, the only person who didn't like to wear official robes and had the right not to wear official robes was the present head of the 4th Bureau, the acting representative of the Overwatch Council, Yan Bingyun, or Sir Yan Jr. Fan Xian threw the robe he was wearing onto the chair and closed the door. Looking at the black cloth on the window, he furrowed his brows. He walked directly to the side of the window and pulled down the black cloth. The light from the sky outside and the reflection from the remaining snow immediately poured into the gloomy room, brightening it up. The sudden strengthening of the light pierced Yan Bingyun's eyes. He unconsciously raised his hand to block it. "You're not Director Chen," Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said. "There's no need to always hide yourself in the dark." Yan Bingyun lowered his hand and shook his head helplessly. This piece of black cloth had been placed on the window of this secret room for many years. It had already become the Overwatch Council's most unique scenery. Who would lightly touch it? Only the commissioner would not take Director Chen's intentions to heart. Fan Xian looked at Yan Bingyun's slightly pale face and haggard expression. He couldn't help but shake his head. Chen Pingping did not care much about the present Overwatch Council. Fan Xian was also too lazy to care. Everything was piled on Yan Bingyun's shoulders. Looking at his appearance, he probably hadn't had a good night's sleep in many days. A faint apologetic feeling welled up in Fan Xian's heart. He walked to the window and narrowed his eyes at the royal palace in the distance. What exactly does the director mean by using such a black cloth to cover it? Yan Bingyun didn't say anything. Fan Xian looked at the majestic royal palace in the distance and suddenly had a glimmer of doubt about his decision to come to the Overwatch Council to find Yan Bingyun. That matter involved the dignity of the royal family and the future of the Qing kingdom. Sir Yan Jr. had always placed the interests of the court as the highest standard. He turned his head and glanced at Yan Bingyun. He truly did not dare to take this risk. There are two flaws. Before, I wrote two things incorrectly. It should be that Chen Pingping is older than the emperor. Also, King Jing is older than Yunrui, just a little older. Shamelessly apologizing. As for the problem of the crown prince not entering the ranks of the princes, I said it this way in the past. As for whether or not this setting is good and reasonable, that is another matter. However, I like to play this way. There is no problem of writing the third prince and forgetting the crown prince. There are only 4 in total. I have 5 fingers and can count them all. Perhaps it is not reasonable, but I don't care. As for Li Yunrui, it was said before that Yunrui gave birth to Wan'er at 15. When the Jingdo incident happened, Yunrui was only 12 or 13. I think all young girls are pure pearls. As for the hide-and-seek that King Jing mentioned, it was a lie. Such an important matter could not be overheard by playing hide-and-seek in the royal palace. As a member of the royal family, King Jing had his own difficulties. He was the most helpless person. He only reminded Fan Xian of the Qin family matter, but he could not tell Fan Xian everything. King Jing only needed a reason to tell Fan Xian, and Fan Xian accepted this reason. A smart person would not ask too many questions. I wrote this very carefully, so there should not be any problems. King Jing is not very old. Some friends say that he does not look like the old gardener. It feels wrong. That is another problem with my setting. Originally, I wanted to write about a decadent prince. His first love died early, so he indulged in sensual pleasures. He was born early and had children early. His hair turned gray early and he aged early. From this, it can be seen that men should cherish their relationships and not fall in love early. There are many flaws in the book. I will admit this, but even if I admit it, I am afraid that I will not have time to correct them. After all, this is not a thesis. I do not have the ability and energy to write every day. It is very tiring. Please understand. I am very grateful. Thank you all for reading, correcting, and understanding. After writing so much nonsense, it would be stupid not to ask for votes. Stretch out your right hand. If you love China, if you love monthly votes, please vote monthly. P.S. This paragraph does not count the number of words. P.S. This chapter was originally going to be called Shocking Secret News, but then I felt that it was too common, even though I am very common. P.S. The Philips TV in my living room that has accompanied my family for 14 years is finally broken. Does this count as me crying about being poor out of habit? Chapter 475. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. In the end, he gave up on the idea of having Yan Bingyun arrange this matter. For one, he had to ensure Hongzhu's safety. For another, he knew of Sir Yan Jr.'s loyalty to the Qing court under his cold exterior. This kind of risk could not be taken lightly. He looked at Yan Bingyun's not-so-healthy complexion and furrowed his brows. Turning around, he placed his finger on Yan Bingyun's wrist and paused. Yan Bingyun's heart was slightly surprised, but his face remained icy and did not have any reaction. "Why is your body so weak?" Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said. "I heard you haven't returned to the manor these days." Yan Bingyun casually tidied up the files on the table and replied, "There are over 30 Jingdo officials locked up in the Celestial Prison. Every day, there are people going to the Supreme Court to cry out their grievances. They are also in a rush to sort out what happened. With both sides pressuring me, how could I have time to leave this courtyard?" Fan Xian noticed the tidiness of the secret room, including the files on the large wooden table. They were also organized neatly. He couldn't help but smile. "This room is even cleaner than when the director was here. It looks like you are indeed used to this line of work." Yan Bingyun also felt a bit tired. He stretched out 2 fingers and forcefully rubbed the skin between his brows until the white skin had completely turned red. Only then did his spirit recover a bit. "Go back." Fan Xian looked at this scene and shook his head. Yan Bingyun ignored him and took out another file to read carefully. His head was slightly lowered. In a quiet voice, he said, "You wanted to beat up the second prince and beat up so many people. Someone has to deal with it. You and the director both like to slack off, but the Overwatch Council can't rely on a group of lazy people to support it." Fan Xian heard a glimmer of resentment and smiled instead. Yan Bingyun seemed to be very uncomfortable with Fan Xian staring at his work. A moment later, he closed the file and raised his head. "Although the second prince's power in court has been completely uprooted by you, I want to remind you of one thing." "What is it?" "You only removed the branches and leaves by the second prince's side," Yan Bingyun calmly said. Yan Bingyun said calmly, "Your axe wasn't able to cut through the thickest tree beneath him." Fan Xian knew that Yan Bingyun was talking about the Yi family, which was far away in Dingzhou but could reach Jingdo in 5 days. The Yi family worshipped a great grandmaster. Ever since the second prince and Yi Linger had married, the second prince had, without question, gained the support of the eldest princess and the towering Yi family. The night attack in Jingdo this time only wiped out the second prince's core officials in court and the martial power he carried with him. It did not cause any damage to the Yi family. As long as the Yi family remained firmly established in Dingzhou, the second prince had not suffered any true harm. Fan Xian sighed and felt somewhat helpless. He had originally hoped to use the 3 city-guarding crossbows he had seized during the attack in the valley to drag the Yi family into the water. No one would have thought that the Northern Qi Emperor's private letter, a greeting from tens of thousands of li away, would force the Qing court to stop the investigation. It made it impossible for Fan Xian to frame the Yi family even if he wanted to. "Let's talk about the Yi family later." Yan Bingyun glanced at him and furrowed his brows. "The second prince's foundation is in the Yi family. Because of this, his reliance on the eldest princess has decreased. This was the brain Fan Xian relied on the most." His words were endless and penetrated deep into Fan Xian's heart. For no reason, his heart jumped. Thinking of the top secret information he had learned today, he began to smell a different scent. Regardless of whether the eldest princess had openly supported the crown prince or secretly supported the second prince, that crazy and powerful woman's methods were so that when her two nephews ascended to the throne in the future, they would still be under her control. The eldest princess, Li Yunrui, was a powerful figure with broad foresight. What she wanted was not small. Presently, the second prince had the Yi family as his support. His reliance on her had decreased. This meant that if the second prince ascended to the throne in the future, it would be much more difficult for her to control him from behind the scenes. Could it be? Thinking of this, Fan Xian's heart jumped. He immediately smiled coldly and said, "The crown prince does not have much of a future. In the end, the second prince will still be beaten down." Yan Bingyun glanced at him suspiciously. Although the Overwatch Council had never participated in the battle between the princes, this invisible rule had been gradually broken ever since Fan Xian had taken over the Overwatch Council. How could Fan Xian be so sure that the emperor still favored the crown prince, whom the Empress Dowager particularly loved, had no chance at all? Fan Xian would not explain anything to him. He furrowed his brows and said, "Send a message to Su Wanmao and Xia Qifei. Have them prepare to pull in the net." Yan Bingyun stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said, "The Jiangnan matter is within our grasp, but to strike down in one stroke, it seems there is no certainty. After all, the capital is watching, unless there is a sudden major change in the situation in the capital." Fan Xian smiled. He knew that his unintentional words had made the meticulous Sir Yen Jr. guess something. He explained in an even voice, "It is just preparing ahead of time. Even if the situation in Jingdo does not change in a year, the emperor will not be able to continue tolerating the Ming family matter." Yan Bingyun heard that it was the emperor's intention. Only then did the doubt in his heart lessen slightly. He asked, "To what extent do I have to pull it in?" Fan Xian was silent for a moment, his mind slightly wandering. The complicated arrangements in Jiangnan this year, as well as the dangers hidden under the beautiful weather, were like scenes flipping in front of his eyes like a trotting horse lantern. The heads of the 3 workshops of the palace treasury, the corpses that covered the mountains and plains of the little island, Ming Qingda fainting in the palace treasury, the lawsuit in the Suzhou government, the old Ming matriarch's accidental suicide, the 6th Ming master's imprisonment and murder, the 7th Ming master's sudden appearance. The Ming family was already a grasshopper in his hands. But, to what extent, he still needed Fan Xian's approval. The wealthiest family in the world is not much cleaner than the royal palace, Fan Xian said to himself in his heart. He quietly said to Yan Bingyun, "Pull it in to the end. Arrange for the people in the money house to do things. Other than that, you can kill a few people in Ming Garden." Hearing the words, money house, Yan Bingyun knew that the big chess piece he had buried for a year was finally going to move. The money house that came from the Shen family and Dongyi in name had been arranged by Yan Bingyun. Naturally, he knew how to deal with the Ming family. However, he had never found out the true source of the silver in the money house. Looking at Fan Xian, he finally couldn't resist lowering his voice and saying, "I don't care where the Jiangnan money came from, but I would like to ask you to pay attention, please don't let it be Northern Qi." Hearing Yan Bingyun guess correctly, Fan Xian would not admit it. He said self-mockingly, "Don't forget who my mother is. Other than the palace treasury, she still has to leave me some silver to spend." Yan Bingyun shook his head and believed Fan Xian's explanation. After all, everyone knew how strong the Yi family's foundation was. Sitting in the carriage on the way home, Fan Xian felt a sense of loss in his chest. It was not because he had made a wasted trip to the Overwatch Council and did not dare have Yan Bingyun participate in the matter in the royal palace. Rather, it was because he had finally confirmed that for Yan Bingyun and the other young talents of the Qing kingdom, the interests of the Qing kingdom and the emperor, as well as the glory of unifying the world, were the truly supreme standards. Yan Bingyun had always done his best for Fan Xian because everything Fan Xian did was in line with the interests of the Qing kingdom. Once Fan Xian truly became that kind of role in the future, how would he view the commissioner with whom he had such a deep friendship? Fan Xian knew this was inevitable. After all, everyone lived in their own time. He had the experience of his previous life, so he could see the differences between the countries in this world more lightly. However, he could not demand this of others. That was an unreasonable demand. Yan Bingyun's role by Fan Xian's side had always been a bit unclear. He was not a member of the Qinian unit, but he was Fan Xian's trusted aide. He had participated in most of his actions, particularly the planning in Jiangnan last year. After Fan Xian clearly realized this, he made up his mind. As for his deal with Northern Qi, it was best not to let Sir Yan Jr. touch the deepest core. However, there was an important and urgent problem that had not been resolved on this trip to the Overwatch Council. How could he connect with Hongzhu? Fan Xian sat in the carriage and propped his chin on his elbow. His brows were furrowed tightly. Unexpectedly, when he returned to the Fan Manor, he heard an unexpected edict. He immediately acutely realized that if he wanted to confirm this matter with Hongzhu, tonight was the best opportunity. The edict did not come from the emperor. Rather, it came from the long-silent Empress Dowager. The Qing kingdom governed the world with filial piety. The emperor was a role model for tens of thousands of people. Although this Empress Dowager was mostly silent, no one dared to underestimate the true influence of this old woman. The Empress Dowager's edict had arrived the moment Fan Xian left the manor. It was a special edict to summon Fan Xian into the palace. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian had secretly snuck out. The eunuch delivering the edict could only wait. Fan Xian tilted his head slightly and listened to Lady Lu's quiet words by his ear. He glanced at eunuch Yao, who had long waited anxiously. He couldn't resist smiling. Given his ability, if he wanted to sneak into the royal palace, unless Uncle Wu Zhu was by his side, he wouldn't have the confidence to hide it from old eunuch Hong's eyes and ears. If he stayed in the palace tonight, it would be much easier to meet with Hongzhu. Furthermore, he was a man. He could not stay in the rear palace. He could only find a room in front of the royal palace. It would also be more convenient to do things. However, he still didn't understand why the Empress Dowager was so anxious to summon him into the palace. After he and Wan left Hongguang Palace hand in hand, Fan Xian couldn't help but sigh awkwardly. Only now did he understand that the old woman wanted him to enter the palace to force him and Wan to go to Guangxin Palace to visit his mother-in-law, the eldest princess. The Empress Dowager didn't want her descendants to be in a mess. After Fan Xian returned to the capital, he entered the palace a few times and always avoided the eldest princess. This reality made the Empress Dowager unhappy. She decided to use the power in her hands to make up for the cracks between the younger generation. Taking advantage of Wan being in the palace, she summoned Fan Xian into the palace. It was already dusk, and the royal palace was dim. Wan glanced worriedly at Fan Xian's expression and pouted. "I don't want to go to Guangxin Palace." Fan Xian forced a smile and comforted her. "After all, the eldest princess is your mother. No matter what, you have to see her." Although he said this, his heart gradually sped up. Lin Wan looked at him seriously and said, "I know you also don't want to see mother. How about we sneak out of the palace?" Fan Xian couldn't resist laughing in spite of himself. "Be careful of the Empress Dowager killing you and me, two ignorant little bastards." Not far in front of them, the door to Guangxin Palace had already opened a corner. A few serving girls were submissively waiting for the arrival of the two of them. Technically speaking, Fan Xian and Wan were half-masters of Guangxin Palace. However, this strange world had long made their relationship with the palace cold and strange. Fan Xian smiled warmly and glanced at the serving girls. His eyesight was very sharp. With a glance, he could tell that these serving girls were similar to when he had first entered Guangxin Palace. They all had powerful cultivations. Passing through the corner of the palace door, a light wind hit him in the face. The wind was very cold. Fan Xian thought of the woman in the palace and couldn't help but shiver. "Yi Chen, come here. Let me see." The eldest princess, Li Yunrui, welcomed them from outside the hall. Although her tone was forcefully maintained calm, Fan Xian could still hear a slight strangeness. He raised his head in surprise and saw the eldest princess staring at her wife beside her in a daze. Wan bit her thick lower lip. Her palm gripped her husband's hand and refused to let go. Fan Xian gently patted the back of her hand to give her enough encouragement. Wan composed herself and walked forward. She bowed slightly toward the beautiful woman in palace attire on the stone steps and quietly said, "Greetings, mother." Her voice was very low and thin. It was indescribably unnatural. The eldest princess stared in a daze at her own daughter. Her slightly hopeful expression abruptly calmed. She lightly said, "How have you been?" Fan Xian furrowed his brows and coughed uncomfortably. Moving closer to Wan Er's side, he smiled and said, "Greetings, mother-in-law." The eldest princess looked at him. A strange smile rose to her beautiful face and said, "You still know to come see me?" For some reason, the eldest princess and Wan appeared a bit cold, but she spoke very casually to Fan Xian. Fortunately, with Fan Xian's interruption, the atmosphere on the stone steps relaxed a bit. The eldest princess held Lin Wan Er's hand and stood side by side on the stone steps. She gave a few orders to the serving girls in the courtyard and prepared to walk into the hall. Fan Xian raised his head and looked at the two women on the stone steps. He found with amusement that Wan did not look much like her mother. However, he didn't know how the eldest princess took care of herself. She was still so young. The two of them stood in a row. They didn't look like mother and daughter. They looked more like sisters. However, although Wan was married, she still could not shed some of her youth. The eldest princess had long bloomed and had not withered for years. She was like a blooming peony, eye-catching. Guangxin Palace had long arranged a banquet. There were no outsiders. It was just the eldest princess and the young couple. After talking for a while at the banquet, Wan finally relaxed a bit. Adding to the mother-daughter nature, the gaze she used to look at the eldest princess also became gentler. The eldest princess seemed to be very happy with Wan Er's change. Her voice also began to show a real gentleness. At some point, she sighed and faintly said, "In your eyes, I'm afraid I have done a terrible job as a mother." The rims of Lin Wan Er's eyes reddened. Tears were about to fall. She had grown up in the palace. Although she was loved by the Empress Dowager, how could a girl not miss her mother? Hearing such gentle words at her mother's side, her heart was a mess of emotions. She didn't know what to say. Fan Xian sat below and looked at the mother and daughter sitting side by side. He smiled slightly. Of this pair of mother and daughter, one was the foremost beauty in Qin Kingdom. The other was the foremost beauty in his heart. Looking at them now, how could it not be pleasing to the eye? However, he had to gloomily admit that his wife was indeed not as good-looking as his mother-in-law. Particularly the eldest princess. Her beautiful appearance, red lips, and bright eyes were still the same. Her long hair, like a black waterfall, was coiled up as before. Compared to the past, she revealed a rare glimmer of true emotion. She was not as delicate and timid as the legend said. On the contrary, this made her exceptional beauty more vivid. The voices of the two women at the banquet became softer and softer. They also became more and more at ease. He was not surprised to see this scene because he still had confidence in human nature. No matter how crazy the eldest princess was, she was still a mother. In Fan Xian's view, This incompetent mother was no different from those brainless middle school girls who gave birth in the bathroom in his previous life. After all these years, she should have felt some guilt and come to her senses. The serving girl behind him filled his cup to the brim. He drank it all in one go. There was a trace of burning pain in his throat. The taste of this Wuliangye was indeed incomparably mellow. However, why did it make one feel depressed and lost? The gaze he used to look at the eldest princess did not change, but the emotions in his heart began to churn. He kept thinking, why did such a beautiful woman walk such a path in life? I'll say a few words casually. Naturally, it doesn't count. Yesterday, when I looked at the book review and comments section, I felt that it was very strange. That's because I wasn't mentally prepared for such a huge commotion. It was comparable to the two waves of Sisi and Begonia. I really didn't expect it, because in my opinion, everyone should have been mentally prepared for so many things to happen. From this, it can be seen that being mentally prepared does not mean accepting the fact that it happened. Well, it couldn't be helped. Not every fairy-like woman with a lot of scenes would be pushed down by the male lead. At least this time, I wouldn't write it that way. I never considered the possibility of Fan Xian pouncing on my mother-in-law. I apologize to Yogurt for this. As for the crown prince and the eldest princess, I don't think there is anything worth making a fuss about. What kind of person Li Yunrui is a very clear picture. Her past is too clear. And I will never gather everything in the name of love like Odin did. Although I have love, I do not have love for characters like the eldest princess and Peggy. For those who do not like this plot, please skip to read it. For those who find it hard to accept, they can only wave their handkerchiefs with tears in their eyes and say goodbye. Brother Tianhua, we will read the next book. We are all friends. I scratched my head, but I really did not expect such a strong reaction. As for those who repeatedly posted and threatened to not vote or read it, and spat vulgarities. I like the monthly votes, and the subscription is what I need to survive. Of course, the two are important, but, please do not threaten me like this. This kind of action will only make your fingers sore. It is useless. I am very timid. I will naturally feel repulsed and then become more determined. I write a story for everyone to read, but it will never satisfy everyone's interests. Maybe some people think it is too evil because of the mess in the palace. Maybe some people think I am too pure because I did not let Fan Xian and his mother marry. To be honest, this is a story I wrote. Although the main purpose of writing this story is to earn money, this money must be earned by oneself. And I think that seriously writing the book according to my own ideas is a kind of sincerity. It can make one feel at ease. As a writer, you should have this kind of awareness because no one will give you 5 million, even if it is not in US dollars. Chapter 476. Yesterday, I said a lot of sincere things about myself, and then there was the call to take it off the shelves in the Chidian message box. As for the strength of the people's struggle, I feel very gratified. Gratified my ass. No matter how reactionary I am, I won't fall to the level of Carrefour. However, I can only shrug my shoulders and not bow. As the main antagonist, of course, I have to continue playing this role well. There are many happy things in life. Blackbelly's writing about Hai Tang makes me very happy. In a moment, I will post it in the public area and let everyone play with it. I can't say any more useless words because another reader has expressed strong dissatisfaction. I also don't like to talk. I'm just long-winded, and my mood is indeed not good. Is that okay? In grief. The coldness outside Guangxin Palace seeped in strands, trying to forcefully change the name of the palace to Sister Chang'us residence. However, with the red candles at the side and the warm fragrance rising, the wine strong, and the spring overflowing, this kind of plan was ultimately just a delusion. Fan Xian watched the eldest princess and Wan'er speak softly. The smile on his face gradually grew. He was no longer as wary and awkward as when he first entered the palace. The eldest princess was still as beautiful and alluring as before. Even though Fan Xian clearly knew of the matter Hong Zhu spoke of, other than shock, he felt a strong displeasure toward the crown prince. At least, looking at the foremost beauty in Qing Kingdom, the young son-in-law could not form too many feelings of disgust in his heart. Of course, this kind of emotion in itself was a wonderful thing. He gently put down his wine cup and smiled self-mockingly. He thought to himself, the eldest princess is also a pitiful person. There must be something hateful about a pitiful person. This eldest princess was the Empress Dowager's most beloved youngest daughter. She was a powerful figure that the emperor had relied on as his right arm these 10 years. Particularly for Fan Xian, hidden under the gentle and beautiful appearance of this beauty in palace attire was a venomous tongue, a liquid that could kill without spilling blood. When he was 12, Fan Xian welcomed the eldest princess's first assassination attempt. After they entered the capital, the two sides became even more entwined in schemes and blood and fire, unable to extricate themselves. However, during these years, Fan Xian's power had gradually expanded while the eldest princess's power had grown weaker by the day. The eldest princess had long acknowledged that her son-in-law was an opponent worthy of her attention, but Fan Xian's two most direct opponents of conflict in the Qing kingdom, the crown prince and the second prince, were actually just pawns thrown out by the eldest princess. Fan Xian clearly knew that since his rebirth, the true enemy of the entire world was the beautiful woman in palace garb in front of him. The eldest princess was Fan Xian's most powerful opponent. Thus, during these years, the Overwatch Council had gathered all of their intelligence centers in Xinyang and Guangxin Palace. Fan Xian understood the eldest princess, even better than she understood herself. This was a question on a psychological level. He could acutely sense the eldest princess's complicated gaze toward that woman in the past, and even her strange feelings toward that woman. If it wasn't like this, it couldn't explain the strange political situation in the Qing kingdom after the Yi family was destroyed. A hateful person must also have a pitiful side. However, Fan Xian would not give a glimmer of pity to the eldest princess. In this aspect, he was colder and more heartless than anyone else in the world. Just as he had said countless times in the past, only when you are drunk do you know the weight of life. Only when you are dead do you know the weight of life. He wanted to live. Whoever didn't want him to live had to die in front of him. How was Jiangnan? The eldest princess gently stretched out her jade arms and slowly put down the wine cup. It was winter, and although there were bamboo charcoal stoves in the palace, the temperature was not high. The eldest princess was also wearing winter clothes that were a bit thick, but even with this kind of clothing, it still covered up the curves of her body and that alluring aura that was everywhere. Wan had already fallen asleep. The serving girls carefully came out of the back of the palace to give their orders. They then retreated out of the palace and closed the doors. Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly but did not say anything to stop them. After all, the eldest princess was her mother. It was not convenient for him to say too much. Jiangnan is very good. The scenery is good, and the people are not bad, Fan Xian replied with a smile. Mother, if you have the time, you can visit Hangzhou sometime. Although it was particularly awkward to say the words, mother, he had no other choice. I went a few years ago. Now, the scenery is the same, but the people are very different. What need is there to go again? The eldest princess left the banquet. As she walked out of the palace, she spoke mockingly. These words were referring to the palace treasury that had originally belonged to her and had now been completely taken over by Fan Xian. Fan Xian did not leave his seat and paused slightly. A moment later, he respectfully said, living in this world, one has to see the people, and one has to see the scenery. People are always like flowers chasing water. Every year is different. The scenery stands tall in the world, but it will not change for 1,000 years. A person's life is short, but they can see the changing scenery of tens of thousands of years. This is what I think is important. The eldest princess turned her head to look at Fan Xian. She tilted her head slightly and revealed a trace of a smile on her face. What do you want to advise me about? I don't dare, Fan Xian replied with a pained smile. The eldest princess smiled slightly mockingly and said, there are very few things in this world that you don't dare to do. However, trying in vain to use words to weaken my will is truly a very stupid thing to do. In front of the Empress Dowager, Li Yunrui was a well-behaved and even somewhat stupid daughter. In front of the Emperor, Li Yunrui was a precocious and even somewhat abnormal assistant. In front of Prime Minister Lin, Li Yunrui was a timid and even somewhat pretentious beauty. In front of the princes, Li Yunrui was a gentle and even somewhat seductive woman. In front of her subordinates, Li Yunrui was a charming and enchanting mistress with a wave of her hand. Only at this moment, in Guangxin Palace, in front of her good son-in-law, Fan Xian, Li Yunrui was nothing. She was only herself, the purest of herself. She did not use any expression or charm or timidity, but she made no attempt to hide it. She calmly faced Fan Xian with her original appearance. Perhaps these two people both knew that the enemy was the one who understood them the best, so there was no need to make any useless concealment. Thus, Fan Xian was not shy. He smiled warmly and only said straightforwardly, time is a passerby of 100 generations. Heaven and earth are the reverse journeys of all things. I don't dare to persuade you of anything. I just feel that life is bitter and short. There is always a great deal of happiness to pursue. Without waiting for him to finish, the eldest princess cut him off and coldly said, what kind of thing is an immortal poet? You can defeat one knife or two. Open your eyes and see clearly who is standing in front of you. Don't always think that by saying some unbearably sour words and smugly showing off a few seemingly philosophical words, you will be able to solve all problems. These words were spoken normally, but the pride and disdain in them appeared particularly sharp. At this moment, there were no outsiders present, so the eldest princess revealed her truest side. Don't always think that women are creatures whose emotions surpass everything else, the eldest princess said coldly. You said in what you wrote yourself that men are all a pile of mud. Since that is the case, don't pretend to be a piece of jade in front of me. Fan Xian had nothing to say. He could only smile bitterly and listen. The eldest princess walked to the side of the palace door and lifted the cotton curtain. Standing on the stone steps, she looked at the quiet night of the royal palace around her. It was not good for Fan Xian to continue sitting at the banquet. He could only stand and follow her out, wanting to hear what this mother-in-law had to say. See clearly who is standing in front of you. The eldest princess did not turn around. Her slightly thin body in the cold wind made one's heart tremble for no reason. It was as if it contained an infinite amount of crazy thoughts. I am not a stupid girl like Hai Tang, she said. I had thought that the North had finally produced a decent woman. Who would have thought that she would still be a commoner? Fan Xian was speechless. He could only smile bitterly and think, who dares to compare to you? In this world where men were superior to women, it seemed that only this eldest princess dared to do what others did not dare and compete with men. In all areas, she competed with men. Fan Xian faintly understood that the eldest princess did not take those things seriously at all. Yes, it was like this. The heavens were about to cry. He scratched his head awkwardly. Facing such a woman, he felt his hands and feet bound. He had no idea how to respond. You should know why Mother summoned you to the palace and the banquet tonight, the eldest princess said calmly. You and I both know, so there's no need to say more. Just hide it a little more. I don't want Mother to be too sad and disappointed. Fan Xian bowed to the ground and said sincerely, I will obey. Obey? The corners of Princess Royal's lips slowly curled up, and the faint red curve of her face was particularly charming under the night sky. I have to admit that your ability is beyond my initial expectations, and you are her son, which surprised me even more. No wonder I couldn't kill you or make you move in these 2 years. His Majesty dotes on you, and the old guys love you. It's just a pity, you're just a stinky man after all. Fan Xian smiled and said, this is a problem of hormones and secretion. Heir? The eldest princess started slightly. For the first time, other than determination, there was a glimmer of uncertainty and doubt in her enchanting eyes. She immediately shook off Fan Xian's purposeful act and coldly said, you're just like your mother, always having so many new words. Fan Xian's heart jumped. Calmly, he asked, you've seen my mother? The eldest princess was silent for a moment and then said, nonsense. When she first entered the capital, she lived in King Cheng's manor. How could she not have seen her? It's impossible not to see her. Speaking of this, the eldest princess's eyes softly narrowed. Slowly, she said, I admired her very much. It could even be said that I was jealous of her. In the end, I looked down on her. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and smiled calmly. I don't think you have that right. These words were very bold, but the eldest princess was not angry at all. Lightly, she said, in many people's eyes, it is all so. Even though I have assisted my brother since childhood and done so many things for the Qing kingdom, as long as I am compared to your mother, no one thinks I am the best. But the eldest princess coldly said, I still look down on her. Without waiting for Fan Xian to speak, she suddenly laughed somewhat nervously. Because in the end, she died. Fan Xian's heart jumped slightly. He didn't know if he could confirm the final truth of history today. However, the eldest princess's following words made him slightly disappointed. And I did not die, the eldest princess said coldly. Who can predict the future? Will I be able to do better than her? She turned around and stared at Fan Xian with eyes as soft as the moon and mist. Quietly, she said, in the end, she did not unite the world. Do you think I can do it? Fan Xian was watched by these two gazes. He forced himself to maintain his calm. After a long silence, he slowly said, evaluating a person is not necessarily based on territory and the records in the history books. He suddenly thought of the letter he had seen that rainy night and said absent-mindedly, just like my mother. She did not help the Qing kingdom unite the world. Who knows if she couldn't do it or if she didn't care to do it. The eldest princess was slightly startled. A sliver of her guard finally appeared. With a glimmer of dissatisfaction, she said, things that can't be done are considered to be not worth it? Just as you said earlier, life is only a few decades. If you want to leave a lasting mark on the hearts of later generations, if you don't rely on the history books, what else can you rely on? My mother did not leave a single word in the history books. Fan Xian looked deeply at the eldest princess and said, I think you understand why. But, you cannot deny her existence in this world because of this. Regardless of whether it is the products of the palace treasury or the Overwatch Council, they are all telling the world something. One day, the history books will be forgotten by people and the yellow paper will be swept into the trash heap. But, the true changes to this world will always be preserved. After the eldest princess heard these words, she was silent for a long time. She then quietly said, You're right. I have not caused any true changes to occur in this world. She paused and then said self-mockingly, other than causing the borders of the countries under heaven to continuously change, the land of the Qing kingdom has continuously expanded. Even if you conquer tens of thousands of li of rivers and mountains, you will still be a bun after death, Fan Xian said seriously. Although the eldest princess had mercilessly mocked him countless times earlier, he still said these seemingly trite words. The eldest princess no longer looked at him. She looked at the quiet scene in the royal palace and said, "Your way of thinking is different from most men in the world. Some men, it is because they are cowardly and incompetent that they gloriously say they have come to terms with it and are indifferent. However, for a man like you, who already has sufficient status and possibilities, to not want to establish a career and leave a name in the history books, it is truly rare, and cowardly." Fan Xian smiled and replied, "Perhaps Ji knows that he does not have this kind of ability. It is not always possible to see someone as talented and bold as the emperor." After saying this, he carefully glanced at the eldest princess. The eldest princess did not look at him. She looked at the corners of the royal palace. It was as if she had sunk into a strange emotion because of someone in Fan Xian's words. "I am a person with a strong desire for power," she said after a long silence. After a long silence, she said, "But this doesn't mean that I like things like power. I only need power to achieve a certain wish, and this wish is something that you people can never understand." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. The eldest princess suddenly raised her hand and took in a few breaths of warm air. Her actions were as cute as a young girl's. She smiled slightly and said, "Women can also do things. I have always wanted to prove this point. Why is it that men always use women in this world? Why can't women use men?" The most beautiful woman in Qing Kingdom finally said to Fan Xian, "This is something I learned from your mother. I have said before that I looked down on your mother because, in the end, she still could not escape the fate of women being used by men. You can go. I am tired. There shouldn't be a second time for this kind of conversation." Fan Xian lowered his head and bowed. Out of the corner of his eye, he glanced at the soft curve of the eldest princess's side profile. He thought about the words the eldest princess had said and smiled slightly. He thought to himself that perhaps this was the unchangeable norm of the battle between men and women. Even if it was her, wasn't it also a reaction after being used by men and not being able to change? The eldest princess looked calmly at his back. She hoped her words would be able to plant that poisonous flower in Fan Xian's heart. Shortly after, she raised her head and looked at the night sky above the royal palace. Her fingers moved slightly as if she was recalling a certain curve. Furrowing her brows, she wondered which palace brother the emperor would spend the night in. There was no pity, no emotion, no reflection. Fan Xian directly left Guangxin Palace. Under the light of the eunuch's lantern, he headed toward the front of the royal palace. His back was a bit wet, not because of fear, but because of some complicated emotion. He couldn't help but think of the first time he entered Guangxin Palace to massage the eldest princess. At that time, his 2 fingers had stopped at the temples next to her beautiful hair, constantly worried that he would be assassinated in the palace. Thinking about it now, Fan Xian at that time had been very naive in terms of politics. The present Fan Xian understood that politics was dark, dirty, and bloody. It was the most untouchable taboo in the world. However, from the moment he was born, he had been tightly embraced by these things. Thus, he had to do it more thoroughly than anyone else and hide it better. The eldest princess was very calm tonight. Fan Xian knew that just like how the gentler the smile on his face, the thicker the murderous intent in his heart, the calmer the eldest princess' expression, the crazier she became. Walking toward the front of the city, Fan Xian watched the dim yellow lantern in front of him sway slightly. He was calm to the point of coldness as he analyzed everything he had seen and heard tonight. As for the poison the eldest princess wanted to plant, Fan Xian had actually planted it a long time ago. He had just hidden it well. How crazy would the eldest princess be? Was it as his father-in-law in Wuzhou guessed? Fan Xian still didn't understand where to find such an opportunity. He suddenly remembered that the eldest princess had not mentioned a word about Lin Ruofu, who was far away in Wuzhou. Given Fan Xian's understanding of that old matter, the eldest princess might not necessarily be heartless toward Prime Minister Lin. Her actions tonight were indeed a bit strange. It looked like that woman had indeed changed in recent days. Substitute? Fan Xian furrowed his brows and quietly muttered to himself. He looked similar to the second prince. Strangely, he didn't look like the emperor at all. On the contrary, the crown prince, who had always been a bit weak, vaguely looked like the emperor. "Sir, what kind of substitute?" the eunuch leading the way asked fawningly. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Trash." There was a special place to rest in the royal palace. It was far from the inner palace. A dozen years ago, when the emperor had been busy with government affairs, he often worked through the night to handle state affairs. At that time, the prime minister and officials also had to wait in the palace and often didn't have time to return home. Thus, the emperor had issued a special edict to vacate an area in the front of the city for these officials to rest. Presently, Qing Kingdom was in a period of peace and prosperity, and there were temporarily no worries on the borders. The palace was no longer as busy as before, and this place had been quiet for a long time. Until Fan Xian moved in today. Before long, Fan Xian had already left the manor. Borrowing the shadow of the tall city walls, he moved forward silently like a ghost. He grabbed a handful of snow from under the palace walls and carefully wiped away the faint scent of sleeping incense on his fingers. Increasing his speed, he headed in the direction of the 9 pine trees. Traveling alone at night in the royal palace was indeed a very risky matter. However, Fan Xian knew that if he acted according to normal thinking, he would only move out in the dead of night when the defenses in the palace were the tightest. Although it was already night, there were still many people in the palace who had not gone to sleep. It was safer to travel unexpectedly at night. His destination was a corner of the royal palace, near the 9 pine trees. This area was still within the boundaries of the royal palace. It was where the washing station was when it was first built. Later, there were more and more eunuchs in the palace, and many residences were built along the washing station. Only then did it gradually become a place for eunuchs to live. The washing station also had a restricted entrance to the outside of the palace. Although it was still guarded by imperial guards, it was, after all, a place where eunuchs and serving girls lived together. It was crowded with people, so the security was much more lax than other places. The officials who took the risk to deliver items into the palace often went through this place. Fan Xian's contact with Xiaofan Palace was basically through this channel. However, he was not going to sneak out of the royal palace tonight. He was going to see someone. To see Hongzhu. Chapter 477. The Qing royal family had always been very strict with the management of the eunuchs. Among the many rules, there was an absolute order that absolutely did not allow the eunuchs to buy residences outside the palace. This was to ensure the privacy and safety of the nobles within the palace and make it easier for the imperial soldiers and guards to control them. It was also to prevent the eunuchs who had the means to buy residences from colluding with the officials in court. However, the eunuchs with status would never lack for silver. Since they could not buy residences outside, they could only put effort into where they lived. Thus, in this seemingly poor area of the laundry workshop, one could still find a dozen very eye-catching mansions. The eunuchs' individual courtyards stood calmly and proudly in the bustling laundry workshop. It was already late at night. Hongzhu had properly arranged the matters in the Eastern Palace. He separately knelt to the Empress and the Crown Prince to say his goodbyes. He then led a few trusted eunuchs toward the laundry workshop. Not far from the inner palace, those trusted eunuchs carried out a bamboo sedan chair from somewhere and invited him to sit in it. In the inner palace, Hongzhu did not have the courage to put on airs. Once he left the inner palace, he would not refuse such things that he should enjoy. However, sitting in the swaying bamboo sedan chair, his expression was not very good. Those eye-piercing little red lumps shrunk in the icy wind. His mood was also a bit gloomy. He forcefully hid the glimmer of fear and unease in his eyes. He said a few words to the eunuchs beside him and scolded them a few times, telling them to serve the two in the eastern palace well. The fear in his heart disappeared a bit because of the scolding. Only then did he feel slightly more at ease. Entering his own little courtyard, he muttered a few words and then entered the room. He sat on the round chair beside the Kong. The style of this round chair was exactly the same as the one old eunuch Hong used to sunbathe outside Hongguang Palace. He had specially asked someone to make it. Every time a eunuch came to the courtyard to do business and saw this round chair, they would think of the relationship between young eunuch Hong and the old eunuch and feel vigilance and respect in their hearts. Hong Zhu was very proud of his skill. He sat on a chair and slowly sipped a pot of hot tea in his left hand. A 13 or 14-year-old eunuch respectfully knelt down and helped him take off his shoes. He then fetched some hot water to warm his feet. Feeling that pair of small hands carefully rubbing his feet in the wooden basin, Hong Zhu developed a strange feeling. It was somewhat satisfied, somewhat proud, and somewhat sad. His family had once been a gentry family and had produced a few jinshi. However, it had been destroyed by the official Lien family, which caused his life to become what it was today. If such a tragedy had not occurred, Hong Zhu thought to himself, given his age, he would probably have passed the spring examinations and begun his official career. Each time he thought of this matter, he couldn't help but feel sad, then angry, and then sincerely grateful to Sir Fan Jr. outside the palace. Hong Zhu was not an ungrateful person. It was said that a scholar would die for those who understood him. He had always thought that although he did not have that thing between his legs, his heart was still that of a scholar. His fingers slowly rubbed the granules on the surface of the purple clay teapot, but his thoughts were not on this wonderful feeling. He thought of the matter he had taken the risk to tell Sir Fan Jr. He didn't know what kind of disaster this matter would bring to him. He had been afraid for many days. It was not until Sir Fan Jr. returned to the capital that he felt a little more confident. He would leave such a terrifying matter to Sir Fan Jr. to handle. Perhaps he would gain some benefits from it. It could be considered his repayment. As long as the matter did not implicate him, it was fine. Hong Zhu's fingers suddenly trembled. He stuck out his tongue to moisten his lips that had become dry from nervousness. In a dry voice, he said, "You can leave. I'm a bit tired. If there's nothing important, don't disturb me." The 13 or 14-year-old eunuch with delicate features took out a dry rag and wiped eunuch Hong's feet clean. He giggled and said, "Eunuch, do you want to call Xiao to help you massage them?" Hearing these words, Hong Zhu was slightly startled. He immediately thought of the serving girl's soft body and fragrant wet tongue. A warm current surged in his lower abdomen, but it could not go to where it should go. Involuntarily, his expression darkened slightly. In addition, he was afraid that these words would be heard by the person in the room. He scolded angrily, "Get out! What's Xiao and Xing The little eunuch didn't know why his eunuch was angry. With a sullen face, he left the room and carefully closed the door to the courtyard and room. He then went to the side room to sleep. Xing that is Yi Guipin's trusted serving girl. How dare you have designs on her? Fan Xian walked out from the inner room and laughingly scolded. Look at your little life, it's even more comfortable than mine. You've gradually become more daring. With a sullen face, Hong Zhu said, "Don't embarrass me, I really don't have much courage." He glanced at Fan Xian probingly and smiled. "Besides, that Xing lady, isn't she my person?" Fan Xian jumped in fright and scolded in a low voice, "Die! How dare you say such preposterous things?" Hong Zhu smiled apologetically and closed his mouth. This little courtyard was to the southwest of the laundry workshop. The terrain was relatively quiet. Earlier, Fan Xian had circulated his Jinqi to listen. There shouldn't be anyone eavesdropping around. It was relatively safe and convenient to speak. He was afraid that Hongzhu would be too shocked by that matter, so the moment he opened his mouth, he first said a few naughty jokes. He sat at the foot of the Kong. The lights in the room could not cast his shadow outside from this angle. Hongzhu carefully looked around and lowered his voice. "Sir, I knew you were staying in the front of the city today, so I guessed. However, this place is also not safe. It's best to leave quickly." Fan Xian nodded and glanced at him. In a low voice, he asked, "Are you sure?" Hongzhu's expression immediately changed. His lips trembled for a while. He looked around fearfully and nodded a moment later. "Keep this matter to yourself. Don't tell anyone." Although Fan Xian knew that Hongzhu was not that stupid, he still reminded him worriedly. Furrowing his brows, he said, "Even if you cover it until it's rotten, don't talk too much. When you're sleeping, it's best if there's no one beside you, not even that Xiao. Hongzhu shivered and thought to himself, F*ck, this is too extreme. Who can control something like sleep-talking? In reality, Fan Xian was also a bit angry at this moment. There were too many things to consider in between how to turn this hot potato into a stone that could hit people. His main purpose in visiting Hongzhu tonight was to confirm this matter face to face. The follow-up arrangements could not be made carelessly right away. He was silent for a moment and then said in a low voice, "Regardless of what you do next, there is one thing you have to remember. First, you have to remove yourself from this matter. Don't let anyone find out that you have anything to do with this matter. This is the first condition," Fan Xian said seriously. "As long as there is even the slightest possibility that it involves you, then don't move." Hongzhu nodded silently. He had long known that if he sold this information to Sir Fan Jr., Sir Fan Jr. would certainly use this information, and he would certainly become an important part of the other party's actions. From the very beginning, he had put his little life in Fan Xian's hands. The kindness of dozens of lives in his clan was repaid with his life. It was nothing. Hearing Fan Xian's concern for his safety, he felt more and more moved in his heart. The candlelight in the room swayed for a moment. The light and shadow were slightly blurry. Fan Xian called Hongzhu to his side and quietly said something in his ear. The more Hongzhu listened, the brighter his eyes grew. However, there was still undisguisable fear and alarm in that brightness. However, this kind of fear and alarm could not defeat the future rewards. Like the officials in court, the eunuchs in the palace also had to secretly suppress the Zhuang family, particularly eunuchs like Hongzhu who had already climbed to a certain level. Starting from a year ago, because of Fan Xian's secret actions, Hongzhu already had no choice but to suppress him in Shufang Palace. Right now, it is inconvenient for us to contact each other. We have to find a way. Fan Xian finished explaining some things and furrowed his brows. But, we can't go through the middleman. There are still some details that I have to go back and think about. Before I return to Jiangnan, we have to see each other again. In the first month, when can you leave the palace? 22, Hongzhu swallowed and lowered his head. The Empress doesn't like the embroidery color that Jiangnan sent as a tribute last autumn. She asked for an edict to order a batch from Dongyi. This is a profitable business. The Empress bestowed it to me, so I can go out that day. Fan Xian nodded and confirmed the time for their next meeting. However, a thought flashed through his mind. He realized that the Empress truly doted on Hongzhu, this eunuch. He looked at the pimple on Hongzhu's forehead and unconsciously glanced at his crotch. Shortly after, he laughed silently at himself. He had seen too many shady things in this gloomy and heavy palace. He couldn't help but want to think about everything 3 ways down. However, this was impossible. The checks to enter the palace were too strict. On the land of the Qin kingdom, it was impossible for a story like Wei Xiaobao's to appear. Fan Xian didn't dare stay in Hongzhou courtyard for long. In the end, he gave a few more careful warnings and left. It was a long time after he left that Hongzhou came back to his senses. Looking at the empty corner of the Kong and the lights in the room, he was confused. The door to the room and courtyard hadn't even been opened. How did Sir Fan Jr. leave? He really is amazing. Hongzhou slapped his thigh and silently sighed in admiration. For some reason, the large stone that had been pressing down on his heart suddenly became much lighter after Fan Xian's arrival. Perhaps he had told this massive secret to another person and split it in half. Perhaps he felt that a godlike figure like Sir Fan Jr. would certainly be able to handle this matter. He had a lot of confidence in Fan Xian. He felt that he could finally have a good night's sleep. With a relaxed expression, he blew out the lights, took off his clothes, and burrowed into the thick blankets. Although Xiao-er's youthful and beautiful body was missing from the blankets, young eunuch Hong still felt very happy. However, Fan Xian's confidence in Hongzhou was not full. He had 3 methods of controlling Hongzhou. One was to help his family get revenge. Another was to give his brother in Jiaozhou countless benefits. What he truly used to tie down Hongzhou was still affection. In this world, everyone was different. Some people could be bought with money. Some people had no ability to resist in front of beautiful women. Fan Xian confirmed that Hongzhou was a very special little eunuch. He was sincere and chivalrous. Otherwise, he would not have been willing to become a nail in Fan Xian's hands in order to repay a favor. He also would not have occasionally curried favor with old eunuch Hong. However, a person's personality and nature would always change according to the environment they were in. Hongzhou was no longer that bitter child running for his life in the mountains. He was also no longer a little eunuch who was bullied by others in the palace. He was the head eunuch in the Eastern Palace. He was deeply favored and trusted by the empress, the emperor's favorite, and the eunuchs and serving girls in the palace fawned on him. Circumstances changed one's temperament. Vanity could melt one's bones, and greed could cloud one's heart. Who knew if, in the future, he would not be unable to resist the temptation of profit and quietly lean to the other side? No one knew that Hongzhou was one of his people, so it would be very easy for the other factions to accept him. If they were playing around, of course, Fan Xian would be happy with this state. If Hongzhou really did something, there was nothing he could do. Fortunately, he had this secret. Fan Xian was very grateful for this secret. Regardless of whether or not it could bring him any benefits in the future, at least this shared secret could make it so that Hongzhou would never be able to leave him again, at least until the eldest princess and crown prince fell from power. Returning to his residence in the front corner of the royal palace, Fan Xian carefully confirmed in the darkness that the little trap he had set when he left had not been broken by anyone. It looked like no one had come to disturb him in these short hours. Stretching out a finger, he brushed away the strand of black hair and rubbed something on the noses of the 2 sleeping eunuchs. He then sat on the bed and took out a bottle of royal wine he had picked up along the way. He sprinkled some by the side of the bed and sat in a daze for a while before falling asleep. Sitting in the carriage, Fan Xian couldn't resist turning his head to glance at the thick red walls of the palace. Unconsciously, he wanted to get as far away from the royal palace as possible. He had entered the palace too many times. Each time he entered, it was like the first time he entered the palace to visit the various ladies. He could feel that cold feeling. It had nothing to do with the weather. It was just cold, thin cold. He hated this smell in the royal palace, so he hated staying in the royal palace all the time. He sympathized with the emperor who had always been locked up in the royal palace. For the same reason, he did not want to be emperor. This was not being pretentious, it was the truth. In his previous life, a post on a certain forum had described the inhuman pain of the emperor's occupation. Thus, Fan Xian wanted to maintain his right to choose his own career. This was probably the biggest conflict between him and Chen Pingping. With 100,000 strings of silver tied around his waist, riding down to Jiangnan, carrying the emperor's sword on his back, and controlling the power of the world, perhaps this kind of life was not bad. Of the 4 great grandmasters, Yi Liuyun's life was the most relaxing. However, he still needed the Juanshan conference's silver and meticulous service. But, Fan Xian didn't need it. Immersed in his beautiful imagination, Fan Xian tilted his head and glanced at his wife. Lovingly and gently stroking the hair on her head, he said, "In a few years, the world will be at peace." A few years? Warner pulled up the corners of her lips and forced a smile. "I hope so. How did your talk with mother go?" Lin Warner looked at the Jingdo Street scene outside the carriage window and suddenly asked this question. Fan Xian started slightly and warmly said, "We chatted for a while, but there wasn't anything of substance. You looked very tired yesterday and went to sleep so early. It wasn't good for me to stay too long." "I was pretending to sleep," Lin Warner calmly said. "If I didn't sleep, it wouldn't be convenient for you two to say anything." Fan Xian was silent for a long time. Only now did he understand that his wife was giving him and his mother a chance to negotiate and see if they could reach a compromise. However, there was already too much blood on their hands. It would be difficult to wash them clean and carry out a second handshake. Feeling her husband's silence beside her, Lin Warner suddenly felt that her spirit was lacking. Her body felt weak. In a quiet voice, she said, "What should we do?" Fan Xian silently pulled his wife gently into his arms. He didn't know what to say. Warner did not refuse his embrace. She tilted her head and gently leaned against his chest. A trace of indifference and hopelessness appeared between her brows and disappeared in a flash. Tears began to roll down like pearls. They formed a line and soaked Fan Xian's clothes. It was not that Fan Xian had not considered the problem of what to do. However, the situation had long been set. He could try to destroy the second prince's ambition, but he did not have a glimmer of hope that he could convince the eldest princess to leave the stage of this world. "Either you die or I perish in the struggle." Naturally, Warner, who was caught in the middle, was the most pitiful person. Fan Xian clearly knew this, but he could not change anything. He held his wife tightly in his arms. For some reason, his heart also began to ache. A year ago, Warner had reminded him that perhaps his mother would once again join hands with the crown prince. Thinking back to the past, Fan Xian couldn't help but sigh in admiration at his wife's sharp intuition. He knew that it was not that Warner did not understand the turbulent undercurrents under the Qin kingdom's golden age of peace. She was caught in the middle and could only remain silent. Always silent, so silent that it seemed to have disappeared. Because of this, Fan Xian felt increasingly guilty and apologetic toward his wife because he could not say anything. He could not even give her a promise. In his arms, his wife was crying silently. Fan Xian gently used his thumb to wipe away the tears on her face. Raising his head to look at the scenery outside the window, he thought to himself that even if a person had 2 lives, there were still many things that could not be changed and many wishes that could not be fulfilled. Chapter 478. This was the first time in Fan Xian's 3 years in the capital that he had planned something on his own. He didn't have the help of the old men or Yan Bingyan's plans. However, he could still use the Overwatch Council's enormous intelligence network and the enormous files and resources accumulated over the years to begin extending the tentacles of a conspiracy from outside the royal palace into the royal palace. The pressure was great, but he had to learn to endure it. In the process of preparing for this matter, it wasn't that he hadn't considered telling the truth to his father and Chen Pingping. However, the thoughts of these two elders were truly difficult to fathom. No one knew how loyal they were to the emperor. He also didn't know whether or not such a conspiracy that would throw the royal family into chaos would be forcefully suppressed by these two elders for some reason. Thus, he chose to move forward in the dark alone. The Overwatch Council's intelligence reports flowed endlessly into his study. In order to avoid drawing the attention of those with ulterior motives, Fan Xian used an ingenious name. He only carefully touched on the information on the outside. Then, it passed through a few hands and was delivered to a remote and quiet courtyard in the middle of the city. He didn't dare to be silent for too long in the study and reveal any traces. As usual, he was filial to his father and wandered freely in the garden. Along the way, he even went to Xian Chiwu's manor to be a guest. However, this year, Xian Chiwu did not invite him as he had in the past. Fan Xian knew that Xian Chiwu was, after all, close to the crown prince. At this juncture, when the crown prince was gradually waking from his silence and using his good performance to fool everyone in the palace, Xian Chiwu must have received the Eastern Palace's signal and no longer tried to rope him in. However, this change was not sudden. Xian Chiwu found a good excuse and personally went to the manor to deliver a generous gift. After a few days, Fan Xian finally thought through this matter from beginning to end. After going through the plan in his mind, he stood in the position of an investigator and used a cautious gaze to examine the clues in his mind. He confirmed that the royal family's investigation from top to bottom would not involve Hongzhu and would not implicate him. Only then did he feel slightly more relaxed. On the 7th day of the new year, Fan Xizha, who had been cooped up in the manor, pestered his brother to go out for a walk. Fan Xian glared at him and retorted, "You think you're still the second young master of Fan Manor? Right now, it is the council that is hiding your whereabouts, but I am sure that the palace already knows where you are. Right now, no one from the Ministry of Justice has come to arrest you because the palace is giving face to father and me. If you go out with such a fat face to show off, where will the palace put its face? Someone will be coming to arrest you soon." Fan Xizha was surprised. Why was his brother speaking so harshly today? But in the year he had been working in northern Qi, he still retained the sinister business genius of the past. He had also shed some of his pompous air. He immediately saw that his brother had something on his mind. His mood was heavy. Carefully, he asked, "Brother, what happened? We are brothers in this world. Tell me what you want and see if I can help you." Fan Xian suddenly thought of the northern Qi aces who had followed Fan Xizha south and were now arranged to live in the country estate outside the city. His heart jumped, but he immediately cast aside those thoughts. He didn't even dare to disturb Director Chen and his father, let alone his precious younger brother. It was just that Xizha had seen through his thoughts, so he had to cover it up. He paused slightly and then said, "On the 10th day, the great prince's manor will open its doors to welcome guests. I will also be going." "The 10th day?" Fan Xizha pressed his lips together and giggled. "Brother, that is an important day. It looks like the great prince truly thinks highly of you, to actually pick such a day to invite you." Fan Xian laughed coldly. "I'm afraid this is Wang Fei's intention. What am I worried about? I said I was going to take Hongcheng, but yesterday, someone from the manor came to remind me that on the 10th day, our second prince will also be going." Fan Xizha sucked in a cold breath. "Good heavens, brother, you beat the second prince into a pile of mud, and now you're going to sit at the same table to eat. Be careful of that woman's dirty tricks." Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said, "Not necessarily. Who would dare to kill someone in the great prince's manor? It's just, I feel it will be difficult to deal with." Fan Xizha lowered his head and immediately understood what his brother was worried about. The great prince had chosen the 10th day to invite guests, and it was Fan Xian and the second prince. Presumably, the great prince still wanted his two brothers to be at peace again. His brother couldn't not give face to the great prince, but he couldn't let go of the second prince. No wonder he was in such a difficult situation. He thought he understood the reason for his brother's heavy thoughts. He shook his head and said, "If you want to eat, then eat. In any case, if you don't say anything, the great prince can't do anything to you." Fan Xian smiled. "That's true." He looked at his brother and suddenly said, "Are we really going out? We can't get out of the carriage. We can only watch from the carriage." Fan Xija was overjoyed and looked at him pitifully. After returning from northern Qi, he had been locked up in the manor. Even during the ancestral worship on the first day of the new year, he could only kowtow a few times in the carriage. He had long been stifled. Hearing his brother's orders, he nodded repeatedly. As the carriage traveled through Jingdo, snowflakes gently floated down like willow catkins. The Fan brothers strolled around the bustling streets of Jingdo twice. In the middle, they stopped by Donbua bookstore to understand the recent situation. The two owners had arrived. The shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall, who had replaced Seventh Yi, quickly entered the carriage to report. However, listening to the report was secondary. Fan Xija only wanted to see the small bookstore he had started. After leaving Donbua bookstore, they went to Baoyue brothel. The carriage stopped outside the hidden back door of Baoyue brothel. Fan Xija tilted his head and looked at the three-story building. His young face was full of the sigh of an old man. Earlier, looking at Donbua bookstore had already made him feel emotional. Now, looking at the brothel that had changed his life, the complicated feelings in his mind suddenly surged. Fan Xian lifted the curtain of the carriage and walked out. Fan Xija was overjoyed. Without saying anything, he followed him out of the carriage. There was already someone waiting at the back door. The group of people quietly entered the back courtyard and followed the quiet stairs directly up to the third floor. They sat in the room that had been empty the whole time. Fan Xija excitedly twisted his head and looked around. Occasionally, his palm would touch the antique furniture that he had personally arranged in the style of the Wei Kingdom. His face was full of reluctance and excitement. Fan Xian smiled and glanced at him. He was not worried about his brother's safety. In Jingdo, as long as he came out with him, no one would dare to force him to do anything. However, looking at Fan Xija's expression, his emotions suddenly stirred. For people like Xija and the third prince, if they were to be judged as good or evil, they were probably characters that should be cut 1,000 times. Yet, he had always stood firmly behind them. He laughed at himself and thought to himself that he really was not a good person. There was no one else in the side room. Only Sangwon and Shiqing'er were personally serving him. After drinking a cup of hot tea, Fan Xian gave Sangwon a meaningful glance. The two of them walked into the hidden secret room in the back. Fan Xija was not surprised. He didn't even glance at the two of them. He only continued to chat with Shiqing'er. Between the lines, he was very concerned about the state of Baoyue brothel's operations after he left the Qing kingdom. After he heard Shiqing'er relay Fan Xian's slight changes to Baoyue brothel, as well as the situation of the girls' contracts, he opened his mouth wide and sucked in a cold breath. His gaze toward the secret room became different. Fan Xija truly admired his brother from the bottom of his heart. With these changes, it looked like the brothel had taken a loss. In reality, he had won the hearts of the people and reduced a lot of unnecessary expenses in the dark. He shook his chubby face and secretly sighed in admiration. I only know how to earn silver, but my brother knows how to win the hearts of the people. What Fan Xian wanted was the loyalty of his subordinates. Other than sucking in the silver of the nobles, the most important use of Baoyue brothel was to gather intelligence. This kind of work could only be handled by Sangwon, who was loyal to him. Have you been to Chen Garden recently? Fan Xian looked at the gentle woman and seemed to ask casually. Sangwon shook her head. No. Fan Xian nodded. Sangwon was his direct subordinate. As long as the old Chen cripple didn't say anything, the rules of the council and corresponding workflow would not be able to interfere with her actions. How is the preparation of the things I want coming along? Sangwon took out a sealed craft paper bag and handed it over. The intelligence regarding the embroidery bureau is very easy to obtain. However, the matter you want to investigate is not easy to start with. She forced a smile and said, the medical officials of the Imperial Academy of Medicine are all old men. Why would they go to a brothel? If you really want to investigate the Imperial Academy of Medicine, I think it would be more convenient to start with the council. Fan Xian shook his head and said, I said earlier that this is a private matter. It cannot go through the council. Also, the imperial doctors are all old men, but what about their disciples? They are all young people. Sangwen's lips were a bit wide, but they were not ugly. On the contrary, they contrasted with her gentle face and gave off a different feeling. She opened her mouth and bitterly said, the salary of the students of the Imperial Academy of Medicine is too little. Before they finish their apprenticeship, they cannot diagnose on their own. Even the manners in Jingdo are not allowed to go. It is truly difficult to get them to come to Baoyue brothel. Fan Xian took out the file from the craft paper bag and narrowed his eyes to look at it closely. Relying on his extraordinary memory, he forcefully memorized most of the key contents on the file and handed it back. Sangwon took out a brass basin and carefully burned the file and the craft paper bag in it. She only stood after she had burned everything to ashes. Fan Xian digested the intelligence in his head and closed his eyes. He shook his head and said, you will stop here. Sangwon bowed slightly and said, yes. Fan Xian took his brother and left Baoyue brothel. However, he did not stay in the manor. After sending Xija back, he once again sat in the black carriage. He thought in the carriage. Regardless of whether it was the intelligence the Overwatch Council had obtained from the outside or the bits and pieces of information Baoyue brothel had grasped, he could only come to a relatively vague conclusion. The Crown Prince's change had indeed begun half a year ago. At that time, Fan Xian was far away in Jiangnan and had no idea what had happened under the surface of Jingdo's peace. Without question, the venereal disease that had long troubled the Crown Prince and made him appear self-abased and weak had been cured. This matter caused the Imperial Academy of Medicine, who knew the inside story, to collectively sink into celebration. They all thought it was a favor from heaven and a blessing for the Qing kingdom. It was also from that time on that, because of the Crown Prince's recovery, his entire person began to emit a glow called confidence. He became calmer and revealed the steadiness that a future emperor should have in his calmness. The Empress Dowager liked this kind of change. The emperor also seemed to be pleasantly surprised. After receiving confirmation from Hongzhu, Fan Xian sank into some kind of deep thought. On a psychological level, he could deduce some things. However, the eldest princess may have only seen the Crown Prince as some kind of substitute or even as a pet like a little white rabbit. But what about the Crown Prince? Even if he was the passive party, where did he get the courage from? Regardless of whether it was the Crown Prince's cowardice and arrogance in the past or the current Crown Prince's steadiness and self-control, neither should have the courage to do such an absurd thing. Although it was beneficial from a political standpoint, the Crown Prince still did not seem like someone with this kind of courage because he was not crazy enough. Thus, before he came to an agreement with Hongzhu, the first thing Fan Xian did was investigate the cause of this matter. He felt it was truly strange. The carriage jolted. Fan Xian's brows were furrowed tightly. As Fei Jie's successor, he was too familiar with things like medicine. After he had a general understanding of the entire situation, he unconsciously placed his suspicious gaze on the medicine. Medicine. In this world, although venereal disease was not an incurable disease, it was still something that lingered in a sickbed and was difficult to endure. Otherwise, the Crown Prince would not have suffered for so many years and the Imperial Academy of Medicine would not have secretly troubled him for so many years. What kind of medicine could cure the Crown Prince in such a short amount of time? What kind of medicine could make the Crown Prince so much more daring? Thus, he arranged for Sangwon to begin investigating the clues along the way. Of course, he used another reason. However, after investigating, he found at the back of this clue was a ball of dense fog. Baoyue Brothel's intelligence-gathering power was limited, and the Overwatch Council supporting investigation had not made any progress. Fan Xian began to feel a glimmer of danger. It was as if he was being watched by an icy gaze from behind. Was this a trap? Could it be that someone had set up a trap and wanted him to expose these things? If he continued to dig deeper, he was worried that he would alert the powerful figure hidden behind the scenes. Thus, he decisively stopped the investigation of the medicine and turned back to the path he should be on. He understood one thing. No one knew of his relationship with Hongzhu. Since it was so, no one should think of using this layer of relationship. If there was another hand trying to control this matter, then their goal was the same as his. As long as he was not implicated when the matter happened, that hand would not be able to use him. The medicine was key, but it was not. The key was still the Crown Prince's heart. Perhaps the medicine could add fuel to the fire, but this kind of method of doing things was rare and powerful. Fan Xian guessed that if there really was a problem with the medicine, then who could have made it? In an instant, a few names immediately floated into his mind. The ones with the motive to do such a thing were himself, who wished at any moment to throw the eldest princess and crown prince off their horses, and the second prince, who had the help of the Yi family but was beginning to faintly feel that the crown prince was going to steal his place in the eldest princess's heart. It could even be the emperor. In the carriage, Fan Xian jumped in fright and unconsciously shook his head. Although he had always been on guard against the emperor had treated him well and did not seem like this kind of person. Furthermore, putting aside how apologetic the emperor was toward the eldest princess, even if he wanted to clean the courtyard, he would not stoop to using such a dusty method. Of course, the first name that rose to Fan Xian's mind was actually Chen Pingping. From the medicine, he naturally thought of Fei Jie. However, he couldn't find anything. He didn't dare take the risk to investigate. Naturally, he couldn't confirm anything, so he could only stop. The carriage came to a remote courtyard. It was the one Wang Qinian had bought for a few hundred taels of silver. Fan Xian walked straight in and sat down on a chair in the innermost room. He silently looked at the wizened old man across from him. Wang Qinian said with a pained expression, "Ziyu is outside saying goodbye. He's going to Northern Qi tomorrow. Mu Tai doesn't dare to take over the first bureau." Fan Xian waved his hand to stop him and straightforwardly said, "You know I don't want to hear about these things." "You could go find Sir Yen," Wang Qinian said with a mournful expression. Wang Qinian put on a long face and said, "This lowly official is not good at this. Besides, this is a crime punishable by the death of 9 generations." Fan Xian glared at him and said, "What crime is there? It's not like we did it." Wang Qinian glanced at him fearfully. He thought to himself that even if it wasn't the extermination of his entire family, if the people in the palace found out about it, even if he, the Overwatch Council's 2 wings, could fly, he would probably not be able to escape death. Fan Xian smiled warmly and patted his thin shoulder. "What does this mean?" "This means that you are the person I trust the most. Besides, you know everything about me. Any one of them is a matter of losing my head. Why would I be afraid of one more?" Wang Qinian suddenly felt great regret. After returning from Northern Qi, he should have followed Sir Fan Jr. and the director's intentions and immediately taken over the first bureau instead of returning to Sir Fan Jr.'s side and retaking control of the Qinian unit. That way, He would not have seen the box that he should not have seen even if he was blind, or heard the secret that he should not have heard even if he was deaf. Someone is investigating. In the light snow in Chen Garden, Chen Pingping sat in a wheelchair with a thick fur cloak draped over him. He looked at the ice gradually forming on the surface of the pond in the garden and smiled slightly. The investigation is very clever and well hidden. We still can't confirm who it is. Fei Jia glanced at the director and shook his head. There are still 3 months until the scheduled time. I hope there won't be any trouble. Chapter 479. The left side of my head hurts badly, so I'm late. Sorry, if I can't take it and need to rest tomorrow, I will ask everyone for leave. Thank you. Fei Jia looked silently at the old man in the wheelchair. He knew that Director Chen had a clear understanding of his own body. Even if he wanted to say something comforting, he couldn't say it. The Overwatch Council was the darkest part of the new Qin kingdom. In this world, the only person who could truly understand a large part of history and understand Chen Pingping's intentions was this great grandmaster who used poison. In the middle of the year, Chen Pingping emphasized the time. After you leave Jingdo, don't come back. I know you've traveled all over the world in your life in the hope that one day you can take a ship to the lands of those foreigners and see how their medicine is made. Since you have this desire, it's best if you go earlier. Fei Jia didn't say anything for now. He knew that given the role he had once played in the military, the matter in the palace could not affect him. The reason the director urged him to leave the Qin kingdom and take a ship was because he wanted him to complete his life's ideals before the matter blew up and let him leave that matter. Although he was old, he still had ideals. I should have gone a long time ago, Fei Jia said with a smile. However, I've taken on a student, and I always miss him. Go, Chen Pingping said sincerely. You only have one life. Do what you like to do. Otherwise, when you're old and crippled, you won't be able to walk even if you want to. Although I don't believe in the retribution the temple speaks of, you've killed countless people in your life. You will always draw attention. Of the 3 old poisoners, Xiaofan is already dead. I heard that the one in Dongyi also suddenly got a strange disease. You're the only one left. You have to live on. Fei Jia was silent for a moment. He then said, I'll listen to you. In the middle of the year, I'll go to Dongyi and go out to sea. Chen Pingping glanced at him and smiled tiredly. Why won't you leave from Quanzhou? First, that place has the smell of the past. I don't like to remember the past, Fei Jia said. Second, since I'm going out to sea alone, I don't want the emperor or Fan Xian to know where I'm going. Chen Pingping nodded. Fei Jia had a very special role in the Overwatch Council. He had resigned from his position in the Third Bureau many years ago, and was now considered to be one of the council's worshippers. The current head of the Third Bureau was his junior. Commissioner Fan Xian was his student. In all these years, he had been Chen Pingping's right-hand man and good friend, so he was very aloof in the council. Although there was still an empty room in the basement of the square building for him to conduct research, he rarely went there. His daily work of concocting medicines and fumigating poisons was all done in a courtyard in a corner of the capital. This courtyard was a monologue research department, and its funds were, of course, provided by the Overwatch Council. The corresponding servants and apprentices were all members of the Overwatch Council. The research results of a master of poisons were naturally quite valuable. Regardless of whether it was the arrow poison needed by the military or the poison needed by the nobles in their backyard to kill each other out of jealousy, they were all objects that people salivated over. However, the defenses of this courtyard were not very strict. Because of Fei Jia's vicious and poisonous reputation, the enemies of northern Qi and Dongyi, as well as the nobles within the Qin kingdom, did not have the courage to go into the courtyard and pretend to be a thief. Who knew what kind of poisonous insects Fei Jie raised in the courtyard or what kind of poisonous powder he scattered? The apprentices and servants who served Fei Jie were naturally not worried about this. They all carried antidote pills on them. Even if they mistakenly took them, there would be no danger to their lives. However, the people in Fei Jie's courtyard often faced financial danger. Because of the research of poisons and the purchase of rare raw materials, it always required a large amount of money. In the past few years, the palace treasury did not have enough money, and the Overwatch Council sometimes did not have enough money to allocate. When Fei Jie was doing experiments, he did not want to wait. Thus, the apprentice's monthly pay was often deducted. After the matter was over, Fei Jie often forgot to make up for it, and the apprentices did not dare to open their mouths to ask for it. Thus, their lives were not very satisfactory. As long as one was a member of the large organization that served the Qin kingdom, people would always find all kinds of ways to earn extra money and fill their pockets. The apprentices in the council were no exception. What they relied on was their understanding of poisons. Although they didn't dare enter that little room and take out and sell Sir Fei's treasured results, some unremarkable little playthings became a way for them to make money. During these 10 years, the assassins, wives, and mistresses all over the world all used different channels to share in the Overwatch Council's poisons. At the same time, money also flowed in. However, the danger of selling poison was too great. No one knew where the poison would be sold. Thus, later, the apprentices began to steal Fei Jie's prescriptions to sell. In the beginning, business was not very good because not many people dared to use the medicine Fei Jie prescribed. It was not until Fei Jie, as Fei Jie's personal disciple, began to treat his own injuries in the royal palace. Later, Fan Ruoruo inherited her brother's skills and began to give lectures at the Royal Academy of Medicine. Only then did Sir Fei Jie's ability to treat illnesses truly receive the recognition of the market. Selling medicine was good, safe, and free of future troubles. 5 or 6 months ago, an apprentice by Fei Jie's side had sold a prescription. This prescription had brought him a great deal of money. He sold this prescription to the famous Huichan Hall in Jingdo. He was particularly careful when he sold it. He did not reveal any clues on the prescription or reveal his face for the other party to see. He only handed over the money and handed over the goods. 4 months ago, this apprentice suddenly became seriously ill. Perhaps it was because he had been in contact with poisons for many years and was infected. Many treatments were ineffective and he died on the bed coughing up blood. Before that student died, the Huichan Hall had already used that prescription to successfully develop the first pill. After confirming its effects on a test subject, the old shopkeeper of the Huichan Hall had wisely turned the existence of this pill into the greatest secret of the Huichan Hall. However, he had not discovered the side effects of the pill at all. He knew that many nobles in the capital needed this medicine. This was what Huichan Hall relied on to display their power in Jingdo. Of course, the old shopkeeper would not be stupid enough to let the prescription leak out. Instead, he used a secret connection to send one pill to the owner behind him. The owner behind Huichan Hall was a 6th-level master from Taichung Temple. This master had always been careful and did not let his connection to Huichan Hall leak out. When he had confirmed the effects of the medicine, a wave of excitement immediately took over his face. Taichung Temple was responsible for matters related to the royal family and moved around the palace. Of course, they faintly knew about the so-called hidden illness of the crown prince in the Eastern Palace these years. This master faintly saw the possibility of his meteoric rise. However, he was not satisfied with just being a person who applied medicine. Thus, he took a detour to find the manor of another clan relative and delivered the medicine. Of course, he did not explicitly say that it was the result of his own medicinal hall's research. He only said that after searching bitterly, he had finally found this medicine among the foreign goods in Dongyi. That clan relative's eyes naturally lit up when he heard this. The master of Taichung Temple had to say that he did not have the prescription and needed to continuously search for it. He calculated clearly in his heart. As long as this medicine remained in his hands, the noble in the Eastern Palace would always need him. Then, his present and future prospects would naturally be vast. The clan relative knew what the master of Taichung Temple was thinking but did not expose him. He stroked his beard, smiled a few times, and said a few words of praise. He only said that he would take the medicine and would not say that the medicine would be sent to the palace. They both knew this. From then on, the miraculous pill personally developed and refined by the old shopkeeper of Huichun Hall was sent through the efforts of the master of Taichung Temple, who worked hard to find it, to the manor of the clan relative who needed the medicine to replenish his strength. Then, through a secret channel, it was sent to the royal palace. Accompanied by tea, it was sent into the crown prince's thin lips. 1 pill every 10 days. It had never stopped. All of this was done in secret. Even if someone investigated, it could be broken at any time on a certain line. However, no one on this line knew that from the beginning, all of the relationships and possibilities on this line had been calculated by someone else. They thought it was secretive and everything was in their control. They did not know that they were actually pawns being controlled by someone else. In the little courtyard, Fan Xian left behind Wang Qinian, who was deep in thought, and walked to the side of the well. Deng Ziyu had been waiting outside the entire time. Seeing that he was here, he quickly came up to report. A glimmer of reluctance and a bit of nervousness naturally appeared on his face. Tomorrow, he would head far away to northern Qi to take over Wang Qinian's position as the head spy in the north. Although this position was nominally under the jurisdiction of the 4th Bureau, it had always reported directly to the director or the commissioner. It was a very important position. After Yan Bingyun was Wang Qinian, and after Wang Qinian was him. He knew that his ability was not in this area. He was afraid that there would be a large gap between him and the other 2 officials in the north. Thus, he sincerely asked Sir Fan Jr. for advice on the matters he should pay attention to on this trip. Everyone under heaven knows that you are my trusted aide, Fan Xian warned. This cannot be hidden from the northern Qi people, and there is no need to hide it from them. However, you are not like Wang Qinian, who can throw off the brocade guard behind him at any time, so you have to be more careful than him. He paused and then said, so, you have to get used to playing the role of a diplomatic official. There are many kinds of spies. Sir Yan Jr. was a secret spy, and Wang Qinian was half light and half dark. You can only be an open spy. Unless there are special circumstances, do not use the network in the north. You are careful enough. There is a lot of information that actually does not need to be secretly inquired about. You only need to attend a few banquets and chat with the nobles of northern Qi, and you will be able to find out. Deng Ziyu was slightly startled. Sir Fan Jr.'s new way of speaking immediately opened another door in his mind. Spies, could it be done without eavesdropping? Right now, the 2 countries have a honeymoon relationship. Fan Xian smiled slightly. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, everything is based on this. Don't embarrass the northern Qi people too much. Deng Ziyu nodded and asked, then how do we sort out the network in the north? My identity is too obvious. You said it earlier, it is not easy for me to get in touch. Lin Wan or Lin Jing? Right now, he should still be in Shangjing. He is an old man and will tell you what to pay attention to. Fan Xian thought for a bit and then said, I have already told you in private about the 1st level. However, don't go to that place. If there are any instructions, go find Xia. He has a business network under him. It is more convenient to send messages to the 1st level. Deng Ziyu knew that the 1st level was the oil shop that Sir Fan Jr. had privately mentioned a few days ago. He thought that Sir Fan's arrangements were appropriate and nodded. If there is a private message for me heading south, go from Xia Mingji. Fan Xian thought for a bit and then said, Baoyue Brothel's branch in Shangjing is about to open. At that time, I will have them contact you. Deng Ziyu thought that Sir Fan had already arranged everything, so he did not need to spend too much effort. Fan Xian looked at his calm face, but a faint apologetic feeling welled up in his heart. Having Deng Ziyu reveal his identity and go to Northern Qi was actually to make it inconvenient for him to come into contact with Northern Qi's spy network. It would give his brother a chance to extend his hand inside and, at the same time, allow Baoyue Brothel to mix in. Deng Ziyu had never doubted Sir Fan Jr.'s intentions, but Fan Xian had an absurd thought. He wanted to see if he could turn the entire Qing kingdom's Northern Qi spy network into his own eyes and ears. This network was too important for Xija's business and his own dealings with Northern Qi. He gently coughed and then said, on this trip north, I will take 300 black knights to escort you through Cangzhou. Naturally, there will be Northern Qi people to meet you there. Other than court matters, the most important thing is that you bring me alive into Shangjing. After entering Shangjing, don't find anyone else. Go directly to the temple of Tianyi Dao to find Haitang. Listen to her arrangements for the rest. Fan Xian raised his head and glanced at the bare-chested young man chopping wood in the corner of the courtyard. The young man's life was full of vigor, but there was still immaturity between his brows. It was impossible to tell how old he was. Deng Ziyu followed his gaze and furrowed his brows. Haitang can arrange it, but, after the Northern Qi people find out, will they have any thoughts? Fan Xian's expression was calm as he said, the Northern Qi people's thoughts have nothing to do with us. I am just sending him over. Deng Ziyu hesitated for a moment and then said probingly, but, if you return him to see Lily, how will you control him in the future? He was Fan Xian's trusted aide, so he knew the story of how the commissioner had forcefully taken this young man from the director. He also knew that this unremarkable young man, who had been locked up in the little courtyard for almost 2 years, was actually the younger brother of the current Northern Qi imperial consort, Si Lily. There are many ways to control him. Right now, I don't need this method, so I might as well be generous. It will be more comfortable for everyone to work together, Fan Xian said with a smile. In his heart, however, he was thinking that the interests between him and Northern Qi had long been intertwined. Whether a hostage was there or not, it didn't make much of a difference. Si Lily's brother had long lost the importance he once had. Deng Ziyu no longer had any objections. Fan Xian waved his hand and summoned the young man over. Looking at the unfairness and hatred that had yet to be smoothed out on the young man's face, he warmly said, You are about to go to Shangjing. Is there anything you want to buy for your sister? The young man spat on the ground. Fan Xian and Deng Ziyu both laughed. Fan Xian looked at him and shook his head. After you go to Shangjing, change your temper. I don't want you to cause trouble for your sister. Also, don't blame me for locking you up for 2 years, you also know about the problems of your past. If I hadn't locked you up, you would probably be long dead. After you go to Shangjing and see your sister, remember to say hello to her for me. Suddenly, he thought of the journey he had taken with Si Lily in the same carriage 2 years ago. His thoughts wandered slightly, but he immediately calmed down and said, Say thank you for me. The young man didn't quite understand and scratched his head. He had only seen Fan Xian a few times and had always been locked up in the courtyard. He didn't know the rumors outside, but he knew that this young noble was certainly an important official in Qing Kingdom. However, he seemed a bit too young. He was a bit surprised that this noble surnamed Fan seemed to be very familiar with his sister, whom he hadn't seen in a long time. It was as if they had a friendship. Hearing this person say this, was he really supposed to be grateful to him? The young man scratched his head again. When the sky darkened, Fan Xian and Wang Qinian left the courtyard and got into the carriage. In the carriage, Fan Xian looked forward and smiled mischievously. Lao Wang, your house is also in this area. Why haven't you invited me to sit? Wang Qinian looked at the smile on his face and felt a pang in his heart. He remembered when he had peeked at the love letter between Fan Xian and Hai Tang and Fan Xian's last threat. In a trembling voice, he said, "Sir, my daughter is still young, let's wait a few more years." Fan Xian paused and almost spat out a mouthful of blood. He glared angrily at the old man and thought, what kind of beautiful girl can you give birth to with your appearance? It was just a joke. However, under Wang Qinian's heavy worry, his ability to be a supporting character had clearly decreased. The carriage stopped at the back door of Wang Qinian's house. There was no one in the carriage, but there was no one in the manor either. Two commoners with ordinary faces wearing coarse cotton jackets appeared in the alley opposite the manor of an imperial relative in the south of the city. The two of them had their hands in their sleeves and were half crouching on the ground chatting. However, the content of their conversation did not seem very casual. It's this family. Almost all of the Empress's relatives have died. This is a very distant relative. What's the use of knowing? Chapter 480. Of course, Fan Xian could not pretend to be an unhygienic commoner and stand guard in front of the imperial relative's manor for 18 days. He was only confirming with Wang Qinian that the hidden line was indeed as they had calculated. They had no intention of investigating further down this line. Furthermore, he knew that today was the 7th. After confirming with Hongzhou on the 20th, he would have to leave Jingdou at the beginning of February and head to Jiangnan again. There was too little time in between. It was impossible to grasp any pattern. The only thing he could rely on was Wang Qinian's unfathomable tracking skills. After confirming the target, the two of them left the entrance of the imperial relative's manor and returned to the back door of the courtyard in the old city. Although Fan Xian was interested in seeing Wang Qinian's daily life, these days had been rather tense. He didn't have much time to enjoy life. With a wave of his hand, he climbed into the carriage. All of his equipment was left in the black carriage. He took off his outer clothing and checked his sleeve crossbow and medicine pouch. Only then did he take out a cosmetic box and carefully apply it to his face. He then used the Overwatch Council's special glue to stick the corners of his brows down. Immediately, the distance between his eyes and brows changed. He also added an unremarkable mole on his chin. The elegant young master immediately became an unremarkable passerby. The carriage stopped outside the Lotus Pond Square in the west of the city. Fan Xian and his people had long gotten off the carriage and merged into the complicated crowd in the west of the city. The area of the west of Jingdou was not large. Compared to the other cities, it was not rich enough, quiet enough, or noble enough. Particularly, the area around Lotus Pond Square was a slum district. The people who lived there all day long considered the problem of survival. Only when there was food in the family storeroom would people consider things like etiquette and morality. Thus, the people in the square did not have a bit more integrity to stand in the turbid world because of the name Lotus Pond Square. On the contrary, it was a mix of dragons and snakes. There were all kinds of shady business. Passerby Fan Xian used the rain hat at the back of his clothes to block out the small snowflakes. With a dark expression, he stepped through the mud in the alley toward the depths of Lotus Pond Square. His expression did not attract much attention in Lotus Pond Square. The commoners on the side of the street and the shopkeepers in the shops couldn't be bothered to glance at him. There were too many people in the square with dark expressions, as if their fathers had died. There were too many brothers on the street. It was not every day that they could collect their debts. Not every time the Jingdou government caught them, they were able to escape. The brothers on the street were righteous and vicious. Their moods were also very violent, so it was normal for them to be gloomy. Passing through a narrow alley with broken eaves, Fan Xian once again fell into the encirclement of the prostitutes standing on the street. Fortunately, it was still early. Although the dedicated prostitutes had come out to stand, the shoddy makeup on their faces and their incessant yawns spoke of their low fighting ability. Only then was Fan Xian able to leave lightly and burrow into a little wooden building in the back of the street to find his destination. The wooden room was filled with an unpleasant smell. The moment Fan Xian entered the door, he couldn't resist rubbing his nose. However, he did not take off the hat on his head. He sat directly by the bed and took out a token from his clothes, handing it to the vigilant paralyzed man on the bed. The paralyzed man's hand could still move. He stared at this uninvited guest with a face full of nervousness. After accepting the token and looking at it closely for a while, he lowered his voice and said, "Since you are one of us, why did you come up so rashly?" Fan Xian didn't have time to argue with him. Straightforwardly, he said, "Has anything good come out from inside recently?" The paralyzed man's expression changed. He didn't know what kind of person this hateful person in front of him was in the gang for him to ask so directly. Since he knew about this matter that required his head, he must be a trusted aide of the gang leader. He felt around in the smelly blanket for a while and pulled out countless boxes. Fan Xian opened them one by one and looked at them closely. His face still had that lifeless expression. It was clear he was not satisfied. The paralyzed man looked at his expression and shook his head. He rummaged around in the porcelain pillow under his neck for a while before finally pulling out half a piece of jade and handing it over. Fan Xian accepted the jade and looked at it closely. The color of the jade was excellent. It was warm and sparkling. It was truly a good item. Furthermore, the cloud patterns carved on it were clearly a royal item. He nodded his head with satisfaction. Not bad. This kind of good thing, the more the better. The paralyzed man smiled proudly. Fan Xian also smiled in his heart. He knew that the paralyzed man in front of him was not as pitiful as he appeared on the surface. Jingdo was the place where the distinguished and wealthy gathered, particularly the royal palace. Since ancient times, tens of thousands of people had provided for the emperor and various nobles. The eunuchs and serving girls who served the emperor and nobles would secretly steal these things out to feed the dark members of the people under heaven. It was like this in the royal palace, and it was also like this in various large manors. Furthermore, there was too much money and jewelry that could not see the light of day that needed to be laundered and exchanged for land deeds in various provinces and counties. Naturally, only the professionals at the bottom could do this kind of thing. The underworld was this kind of professional, so the truly powerful gangs in the world would all leave a small branch in Jingdo. These Jianghu people did not dare oppose the court, but they would not be courteous in being the court sewers and earning bits and pieces of silver to spend. Speaking of which, it was very strange. It was because these Jianghu people were unusually peaceful that Jingdo still did not have any famous names in the underworld. The Hulua gang was a very unremarkable gang responsible for taking over the stolen goods in the royal palace. When Fan Xian was in Hangzhou, he had talked a lot with Xia Qifei and had some understanding of these secret powers. Only now did he know that the Hulua gang had a fixed passageway in the palace. He couldn't help feeling deep veneration for them, which was why he had come to Lotus Pond Square today. This paralyzed man was responsible for the first part of the Hulua gang's sale of stolen goods in Jingdo. These people were doing things that required their entire families to be executed, so they were very careful. Each part was not connected, and the people receiving the goods often changed. This gave Fan Xian an opportunity to take advantage of. As for the token, it was something the Overwatch Council had prepared many years ago. The paralyzed man looked at his satisfied smile and proudly said, apparently, this was something the previous emperor had gifted to the Empress Dowager's paternal family. However, something happened later. For some reason, it has now returned to the Eastern Palace. This took a lot of effort. Fan Xian's heart jumped. He smiled and said, "Why would the nobles care about these little things? They just casually leave them in the storeroom. After a few decades, they won't forget to use them." The paralyzed man sighed and said, "Yes, if this piece of jade was sold in Jiangnan and then sold in Jiangbei, it could probably buy thousands of mu." Fan Xian didn't want to accompany him in sighing and said, "First time meeting, I don't know the rules." He spoke very straightforwardly. On the contrary, the paralyzed man did not have any suspicions. He took out an account book from under the blanket and pointed to the space for first-class wine written on it. "It's here." Fan Xian smiled and said, "You paralyzed man, you sure can hide things under the blanket." The paralyzed man mumbled a few words as if he was recalling the past. He had followed the gang leader to kill everywhere and had been beaten to a pulp by someone with a hammer. The gang leader had taken pity on him, which was why he had come to Jingdo to manage these matters. Fan Xian didn't know much about the story of the Halua gang, so he didn't respond. After he signed the book with his altered handwriting, he handed over a banknote from his clothes and said, "The first installment is 30%, right? Don't take more from me." The paralyzed man looked at the 1,000 liang banknote and nodded. "That's about right. Although this jade is certainly worth more than this, it is, after all, a taboo item. I can only sell it at a discount." After doing all this, Fan Xian carefully put the jade away. Without saying anything more, he walked out of the dark room. Walking along the mud-covered streets of Lotus Pond Square, the sky was still dark and gloomy. Fan Xian's mood, which had been tormented by the matter for a long time, relaxed. He had already thought through how to handle the entire matter. Although this plan was indeed complicated and annoying, Fan Xian had no other choice. In order to ensure Hongzhu's safety and to keep himself hidden behind the scenes, he had to approach the truth with so many twists and turns and expose it. Now that he had a plan in mind, although he didn't know if there would be any problems, it was much better than a few days ago when he faced a pot of braised pork shoulder and couldn't find a place to eat. He had thought through the entire process. All that was left was for Hongzhu to handle. Of course, he also needed the emperor to be as sensitive, suspicious, and full of imagination and intelligence as Fan Xian expected. Just as the eldest princess and Fan Xian had always thought, the Qing emperor was indeed a sensitive and suspicious person. A figure who had stood at the top of politics for a long time would always imagine the worst of all conspiracies and use his intelligence. Thus, the more Fan Xian thought about it, the more relaxed he became. He felt that the emperor was going to be played by him this time. To be able to scheme and not let himself fall into it, Fan Xian felt a rare glimmer of pride. Although he was now a 9th-level ace and a powerful figure, he had always maintained a calm state of mind. However, he could not suppress his pride today. It was probably because, ever since he had entered the Overwatch Council, he had always been weak in the area of conspiracies. In the past, he had Yan Bingyan's help, so he didn't see any problems. However, after the Jiaozhou incident, Chen Pingping had cursed him harshly in his letter and was very disdainful of his ability to weave conspiracies. Thus, Fan Xian was truly proud today. The more he thought about it, the prouder he became. Just as he was feeling proud, he saw a frustrated person under the archway at the exit of Lotus Pond Square. Fan Xian looked at the person with a blue cloth table under the archway, shouting for business in a loud voice. He couldn't help but stop in a daze. Stopping his steps, he hid behind the crowd and took a closer look. It was a litigation master. He was shouting at the top of his lungs behind the blue cloth table to drum up business. His face was slightly pale. It was as if something had happened to his body. Even his voice appeared weak. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and let the rain hat cover most of his face. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the table. A strange feeling rose in his heart. That litigation master's business was very bad. Not only did no one ask him to write a lawsuit for them, not even a single person asked him to write a lawsuit on their behalf. Furthermore, some of the commoners who seemed to vaguely know the inside story were walking far away from the blue cloth table, as if afraid of being tainted by bad luck. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and then left Lotus Pond Square. About an hour later, in a private room in a normal restaurant, Fan Xian's face was full of smiles. He pushed a plate of food in front of him and said, "Eat slowly and talk slowly. Why are you like this now?" Sitting across from him was the litigation master from Lotus Pond Square. He was also the person who had fought Fan Xian's first lawsuit in Jingdo and had later been kidnapped by Fan Xian to Jiangnan to help him in the Ming family lawsuit, Song Shiren. Song Shiren had a bandit nickname, Fu Zui. He was also known as the best litigation master in the world. He had always traveled in the government offices. How could he have fallen to the point of setting up a stall on the street? At the time, Fan Xian had been shocked when he saw him on the street. It was only later that he had his subordinates invite him over. However, he didn't dare go to Baoyue brothel. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the dejected litigation master. Although he guessed something, he still couldn't resist opening his mouth to ask about his recent situation. Song Shiren didn't eat. He only sipped a mouthful of white wine and gazed deeply at Fan Xian. Shortly after, he sighed and laughed bitterly 3 times. He didn't say anything. "Speak. Does it have something to do with me?" Fan Xian asked. Song Shiren sighed again. After a moment of silence, he said, "Since you guessed it, then I won't be afraid to embarrass myself. After returning from Jiangnan, the people in Tongren and the other streets knew of my glory in Jiangnan and looked at me more highly. They also knew that I was working for you, so they all nodded and bowed to me. However, later, the rumors changed. For some reason, not only did no one ask me to fight a lawsuit, even my good friends all left me. You don't know why?" Fan Xian sighed. "You and I both know why." Song Shiren forced a smile and said, "Even if I knew, would I dare to go around crying injustice?" Fan Xian fell silent and listened to Song Shiren's sorrowful and cold narration. Only then did he know that the once best litigation master in the world had lived such a wretched life in the next few months. Not only was it a problem of not being able to earn money, but it seemed that in an instant, the entire Qin kingdom's bureaucracy had begun to target Song Shiren. The Jingdo government, Ministry of Justice, and even the Ministry of Rights and Taichung Temple all came to make trouble for him. They used all kinds of excuses. In any case, they stripped away all of his family property like it had been hit by wind and rain. No matter how eloquent Song Shiren was, how could he stand against the court's unreasonable methods? Furthermore, the powerful figures he was familiar with in the past were now silent. It was as if they were afraid of the person behind Song Shiren. Presently, Song Shiren could only take his family and rent a place like Lotus Pond Square. His life could be said to be wretched. Fan Xian and he met each other's eyes and shook their heads at the same time. The two of them both knew the source of all of this. Song Shiren had helped Fan Xian fight the Ming family case in Jiangnan. Putting aside how much he had helped Fan Xian, the important thing was that through Song Shiren's mouth, Fan Xian's idea that the eldest son's right to inherit naturally could not be violated, this sacred rule that was not in Qing law but had entered people's hearts, had been broken into pieces. This was a great taboo in the palace. The Empress Dowager had quietly said something, and there were countless people who thought of ways to make Song Shiren shut up. This was a very deep lesson. At least he's fine. Song Shiren touched his neck with some lingering fear. To be able to survive is already heaven's pity. Fan Xian knew that Song Shiren had not been killed completely because the nobles in the palace had given him some face. He couldn't help saying self-mockingly, "Even if no one dared to help you, why didn't you come find me? When all is said and done, this matter was caused by me." Since you came to find me for help, I had to put in some effort. Song Shuren smiled bitterly and said, I fought a case for you and almost had my family destroyed. How could I go and make trouble for you? Fan Xian knew that this person did not mean what he said. He was probably afraid that if he came to his door, it would instead add more trouble. He looked at Song Shuren and smiled. Don't worry about anything. He took out a banknote from his clothes and handed it over. Song Shuren raised his head and looked at the frightening amount written at the top. He couldn't help but jump in fright. Although he was also a person who had seen the world, he really didn't dare to accept such a large sum of money. Fan Xian said, I will immediately arrange for your entire family to leave the capital. You don't have to worry about safety. Take this money and use it first. Consider it my compensation to you. Song Shuren was silent for a long time and didn't reply. Fan Xian glanced at him and said, Relax, if I wanted to kill you to escape disaster, would have done so long ago in Jiangnan. You know I have never been afraid of killing a few people, you have to understand my personality. As long as someone has helped me, I will certainly protect them and give them sufficient compensation. The resentment in the palace will fade in a few days, Fan Xian said meaningfully. At that time, as long as I protect you, who would dare to touch you? The 10th day of the first month was also known among the Qing people as the last 10. It could be considered a relatively important day in the new year. Although it was not like the tens of thousands of people going out on the 7th day, the streets were still lively. Having planned everything, Fan Xian appeared particularly relaxed. He sat in the carriage with Wan and strolled around Jingdo for half a day before, under the endless urging of his wife and Teng Zijing, he changed his route and drove directly to Prince Heching's manor, which was not far from the royal palace. The doors of Prince Heching's manor were wide open, but there were not many guests. The great prince was standing on the stone steps waiting for Fan Manor's carriage. The carriage stopped in front of the manor. The great prince looked at Fan Xian and smiled coldly. You've come so late. Don't slip away first later. The title of the book was Godly Movement Mecha. The book number was 1001948. Highly recommended because this guy's public version is free and updates 5K a day. Such sincerity and excellence truly makes me admire him. Also, my illness has not healed and is very uncomfortable. My condition is very poor, please forgive me. Recently, I haven't added much because it is not convenient. Please understand. Chapter 481. The snow in Jingdo stopped and fell again. It was not as free and clear as the snow in Shangjing in northern Qi, nor was it as annoying as the lack of rain and snow in Danzhou. It was as lingering and annoying as the spring rain in Jiangnan. Fan Xian stretched out his hand to brush the snow from his hair angrily. Looking at the great prince at the door of the manor, he said, It's just a meal. Why are you so nervous? In reality, the great prince was not wrong. If the inscription on the invitation did not have the name of the great princess of northern Qi, Fan Xian would not have escaped early. He might not even have come. Fan Xian thought painfully, why did you summon me, a descendant of the Fan family, for a gathering of royal brothers? He really didn't want to come. Firstly, he didn't want to see the second prince and his wife when the situation was unclear. Secondly, he was thinking about those sinister things. If the crown prince, the target of his plot, continued to talk to him gently, what should he do? There was no place for him to speak. His wife was already standing in front of the great prince, beaming with joy. She giggled and said a few words, and then the two of them walked side by side into the prince's manor. Fan Xian looked at this scene of deep sibling affection and thought to himself that this brother was not his cousin. His heart ached slightly. How could he not enter the manor? Fan Xian had not been to Prince Heching's manor many times. Once he entered the manor, there were naturally people waiting on him to sit. Fan Xian looked around and didn't see anyone else, so he relaxed. On the other side of the room, Wanner was talking warmly about something with the great brother she hadn't seen in a long time. Fan Xian was bored sitting alone in the hall and couldn't be bothered to interrupt. He half closed his eyes and rested. However, the words beside him kept drilling into his ears. One moment, Wanner was teasing the great prince about his appearance after marriage. The next moment, the great prince was asking Wanner if she had gotten used to life in Jiangnan, if Fan Xian had bullied her, and how the scenery in Jiangnan was. What kind of yamen was the Hangzhou society? By the time Wanner explained clearly to the great prince that the Hangzhou conference had nothing to do with the yamen, Fan Xian couldn't resist yawning. He felt bored. This pair of brother and sister were important figures in the royal family. One of them was a general who had once led troops and killed people. How come when they talked, they were no different from the gossipy women of the Ting family? Just as he was cursing to himself, he suddenly felt a breeze behind him. He vigilantly opened his eyes and turned around, only to see a beautiful young woman dressed in gorgeous clothing lift the curtains and enter. Fan Xian was slightly startled. He stared at the flower in the woman's hair and smiled. "Greetings, Wang Fei." The person who had come was the great princess of northern Qi, the present Wang Fei. When this foreign noble had married into the Qing kingdom, Fan Xian had been the envoy. The two of them had traveled thousands of li together, so they were more familiar with each other than the others. However, ever since she and the great prince had married, it was not convenient for Fan Xian and her to maintain contact. Even the secret promises they had made to each other basically had no room to put into practice. After not seeing each other for a long time, he felt a bit unfamiliar. After the first greeting, Fan Xian didn't know what to say. Lin Wanner saw the princess come out and quickly stood up to salute, but was forced by the princess to call her sister-in-law according to the customs of the people. Wang Fei's appearance was dignified, particularly the magnanimity at the tips of her brows and the corners of her eyes. It made one feel amiable and happy. However, at this moment, her calm gaze turned and stared at Fan Xian. Revealing a strange expression, she said, "I haven't seen you in a long time. How have you been?" Fan Xian was facing her. He had long seen the glimmer of severity and anger in the gentleness in her eyes. Additionally, she had called him Little Duke twice. He knew she was angry. However, he knew that Wang Fei's anger had nothing to do with the matters between a man and a woman. She also wasn't truly angry at him for not seeing or communicating much after sending his relatives back home. It was probably because of the Yangtsong Alley incident. He unconsciously glanced at the great prince's expression and found that he could still force himself to be calm. He could only hide his awkwardness and smile. "What the great princess is saying, it is best to call me Fan Xian as usual. How about, brother-in-law?" Although this joke was not funny, Fan Xian's way of addressing her was very particular. He still respectfully called her princess, using an old form of address. Firstly, it made her think of their old feelings. Secondly, he knew that Wang Fei would feel much better after hearing this form of address. Although the great princess of northern Qi was married to the great prince of the Qing kingdom and it was not a disgrace to her identity, she was, after all, marrying far away in a foreign country. Furthermore, the background of the marriage was the Qing kingdom's victory in the war between the two countries. Thus, for the northern Qi people, particularly the great princess, this marriage was not very glorious. Furthermore, the great prince was titled Prince Heqing. What did that mean? Each time he thought of the great prince's title, Fan Xian couldn't resist wanting to laugh. He thought that the emperor was indeed a dark and vengeful person. The great princess probably hated Prince Heqing's name. As expected, Wang Fei paused upon hearing the words, "Great Princess." She had lived in the Qing kingdom for almost 2 years, married a good man, and lived a good life. However, she was, after all, in a foreign land. Although she strictly forbade the servants in the manor from using her full title, it had been a long time since anyone had called her princess. Wang Fei's gaze immediately softened. She looked at Fan Xian and smiled slightly, temporarily giving up on the idea of making trouble for him. Lin Wan and the great prince were both smart people. They could tell that Fan Xian and Wang Fei had carried out a certain level of testing in the previous 2 sentences. Involuntarily, they looked at each other and couldn't resist shaking their heads, thinking that these two were very tired. The 4 of them sat down and chatted for a while. Fan Xian couldn't resist turning his head to glance in the direction of the main door. Shaking his head, he said, "I said I came early today, but Wan insisted on rushing me. Everyone is here, just waiting for you." The great prince glanced at him and said, "You, as a new duke, have a lot of face to have 2 princes waiting for you." Fan Xian was slightly surprised. "The crown prince will not come today," the great prince explained. The great prince explained and said that Qingqian had already sent a valuable gift. The second prince, the second princess, and the Hongqing siblings had already sat in the back garden. The crown prince not coming made Fan Xian feel much more at ease. He knew that this was a normal thing. The crown prince's identity was different. He was the heir to the country. Although his position seemed to have wavered these 2 years, his position was still higher than that of the other princes. When the royal family gathered, he had to be invited. However, it was not convenient for him to come. Wan said in surprise, "Second brother and the others are already here. Then, what are we still sitting here for?" This was not a stupid question. It was to purposely lessen the negative effect the great prince's words had on the atmosphere in the hall. The great prince listened to Wan's words and smiled. "Let's go over now." He then glanced at Fan Xian. Fan Xian laughed bitterly and thought, "Since I'm already here, are you still afraid that I'll make a scene in the manor and beat up the second prince?" As he thought this, he rose and led Wan toward the back garden. The great prince and his wife shook their heads at the same time, thinking that Fan Xian truly did not have the self-awareness of being a guest. They also followed him toward the back garden. As they left the hall, Wang Fei thought of the secret dealings between Fan Xian and her own king and couldn't help but furrow her brows. To the side, the great prince sighed. His heart trembled. This manor had been built by imperial edict the year before. Its main purpose was to be used for the marriage between the 2 countries. In order to reflect the face of the Qin kingdom, the manor had not been thrifty at all. It was especially extravagant and took up a large amount of space. The group of people walked toward the garden for a long time before they saw a flower hall in the distance facing a lake. Faint sounds of conversation could be heard coming from inside. The lake was not large. The weather was slightly better than the day before. The thin ice on the surface of the water had shattered but could not be moved. It rose and fell with the lake water and reflected the faint gray light from the clouds in the sky. It looked like countless pieces of gemstones. The flower hall was particularly exquisite. The black wooden windows on the 3 sides facing the lake were well sealed. Inside, there were cotton curtains that blocked out the wind. In the middle, about half the height of a person, there was a narrow opening. It was inlaid with high-quality glass produced by the palace treasury. Such a design allowed the cold wind on the lake to not disturb the interest of the young nobles. It also allowed one to admire the beautiful winter scenery through the window. It was very thoughtful. Fan Xian looked and smiled. "I like this place. If you like it, come more often in the future. It's not like you're an outsider." The great prince's eyes looked forward. He didn't know if the word outsider had a deeper meaning. He said, "At first, this manor was grander, but I didn't like it. Fortunately, Wang Fei was clever and changed it a lot. It is no longer what it used to be. If you really like it, you should go visit her." Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at Wang Fei. He smiled and didn't say anything. The great prince said with a bit of pride, "It doesn't matter if other people say I'm henpecked. In any case, whatever she likes, I will get it for her. Just this circle of glass along the flower hall cost me a lot of silver." Hearing these words, Wang Fei liked it in her heart, but she couldn't keep her face in front of Fan Xian and his wife. She quietly glared at him. The great prince chuckled and changed the topic. "Speaking of this glass, it really is expensive. Speaking of which, you are now the head of the palace treasury. In the future, if you want to change glass, you have to sell it to me at a lower price." Fan Xian begged for mercy. "I say, Your Highness, please spare me. As a great general, do you still care about this little bit of glass? Don't say it's cheap. In the future, if you want anything from the palace treasury, write me a letter and I'll buy it for you." The great prince was not happy. He shook his head and said, "The palace treasury is important. The silver you earn for the court has to be spent on the river works and border problems. You can't take advantage of it here." Fan Xian knew the great prince was such a loyal person. He was not surprised. He smiled and said, "However, you're using glass to please the great princess. I'm afraid you'll have to spend a lot of money in the future." The great prince asked strangely, "What do you mean? Is there a lack of glass in my courtyard?" Wang Fei covered her mouth and smiled to the side without saying anything. Fan Xian laughed mockingly and said, "The great princess grew up in the northern Qi royal palace. You haven't been to the royal palace. The roof of the great hall is completely made of glass. Sunlight can seep in and reflect on the green jade platform and the clear water and white fish beside it." The great prince was shocked and sighed. "In the past, I had only heard of it. I thought it couldn't be so exaggerated. Wang Fei has also never talked to me about it. Is it actually true?" He clicked his tongue and sighed. Other thoughts rose in his heart. He thought to himself that the northern Qi royal palace was so luxurious. No wonder the strength of the country was weakening by the day and couldn't withstand a single blow. However, these words couldn't be said generously in front of his wife, so he could only swallow them down. Fan Xian had said those words earlier. He had also sunk into the memories of his trip to northern Qi. He was very willing to admire spectacular or extremely beautiful things, so his impression of Shangjing had always been good. Of course, the girls in the city were also not bad. Involuntarily, a strange smile rose to the corners of his lips. Wang Fei also began to miss the scenery of her home country. Lin Wan looked at the smile at the corner of Fan Xian's lips and couldn't resist pressing her lips together and huffing. Just like this, each with their own thoughts, they entered the flower hall. In the hall, 2 men and 1 woman had already come to greet them. It was the second prince and Hongcheng. Princess Rojia affectionately called Wan, her sister, Wan, affectionately called second brother, and Hongcheng affectionately called Anji. They chatted leisurely as they looked at the lake view and the tribute sent from the south. It was as if nothing had happened these past few years in Jingdo. It was as if Fan Xian and the second prince were truly 2 brothers who could not be more intimate. Was this a natural ability of the royal family? As Fan Xian sighed in his heart, he listened to everyone's conversation. He knew the true meaning of the great prince's banquet. Furthermore, he was worried that Hongcheng would once again step onto the second prince's boat. Although he was also very good at this kind of conversation, he was still not as used to it as those who had grown up in the royal family. He begged for mercy and ran off to pee. In the corner of a small courtyard not far from the flower hall, Fan Xian, who had been brought here by a servant, was shocked. He looked at the girl who came out from inside, the girl whose eyes were as bright as jade, without a trace of impurity. Fan Xian waved his hand to have the servant leave. Looking at Yi Ling, whose face was full of shock and whose hand was still at the waist of her dress, he said with both amusement and anger, "Girl, you should pay attention to your appearance. Don't you know to tidy up in the inner room before coming out? How can you let the servants see you?" Yi Ling covered her mouth and smiled. "I look like this, teacher." Once the words left her mouth, the two of them froze at the same time and sank into silence. Only now did they remember that after not seeing each other for a year, Yi Ling had long married and become a Wangfei. She was no longer the unruly little girl who pestered Fan Xian to fight. Could Fan Xian still be her teacher? Chapter 482. Walk with me. Fan Xian extended his right arm and made an inviting gesture. Yi Linger stared at his face in a daze. Shortly after, she smiled and turned her head to glance at the room in the corner of the courtyard. With a teasing smile, she said, "Why aren't you in a hurry now?" Fan Xian laughed loudly. "It's just a pea escape." Yi Linger took a few steps forward and walked shoulder to shoulder with him. Tilting her head, she looked at him with her bright eyes and asked curiously, "Teacher, does the conversation in the flower hall make you so uncomfortable?" Hearing the word "teacher" again, Fan Xian's heart warmed for no reason. After a moment of surprise, a warm smile rose to his face and he replied, "You know me, I'm not used to that kind of situation. How have you been in Jiangnan?" Yi Linger pulled back her shoulders and followed by his side. "I know something happened on the way back. I should have gone to see you, but..." It wasn't that she wanted to say something but stopped. She helplessly closed her mouth. The entire Qing kingdom was guessing the truth behind the attack in the valley and who the true killer was. Many people had once cast suspicious gazes on the second prince. After Yi Linger learned of the assassination attempt on Fan Xian, she couldn't help but be shocked and worried. She had even privately asked her husband. Although she had received the second prince's guarantee that the valley incident had nothing to do with him, given the present situation and Yi Linger's Wangfei status, it was indeed not convenient for her to visit the Fan manor. Fan Xian smiled and very naturally patted her shoulder. "I'm a sturdy person, how could something happen to me so easily?" The hand he had extended suddenly froze. Fan Xian pulled it back and laughed at himself. She was now married to a Wangfei. His words and actions had to be measured. As the two of them chatted about the situation after they parted, they walked along the path in the manor's winter forest toward the lakeside. Fan Xian quietly said, "Wanner hasn't seen you in a while. She's been thinking about you a lot these days." Before Lin Wanner and Yi Linger married, they were the best of friends in the boudoir. However, now that they had separately married the two people in the younger generation of the Qing kingdom who could not coexist with each other, it was inevitable that there would be great trouble. Yi Linger sadly said, "I also miss her. She usually comes to the manor to play when she has nothing to do," Fan Xian said warmly. "If it's not convenient for you to leave the manor, I'll take her to the manor to see you." Yi Ling sighed and stopped beside a bare winter tree. Gazing at Fan Xian, she faintly asked, "Teacher, I really don't understand you men, including him. You all speak so similarly, it makes people who listen always think that there has never been anything between you." The "he" in this sentence was naturally referring to the second prince. Fan Xian smiled and said, "What does men fighting to the death have to do with the friendship of you girls?" "No problem." Yi Linger had a straightforward personality. She raised her face and said, "Do you think that if one of us becomes a widow, we can still talk as freely as before?" Fan Xian was startled. A moment later, he forced a smile and said, "Then what do you think?" Yi Linger stood silently by the tree and sighed after a long time. She knew that there were many things that could not be changed according to her wishes. As a daughter of the Yi family, in the days before she married, she could wear a red dress like fire and ride a horse through the long streets, letting the people of Jingdo be familiar with her face. She did not care at all what the officials would say or what her father would be angry about because she was Yi Linger. But, what was Yi Ling'er to the entire Qing kingdom? I saw your great-uncle in Jiangnan. Fan Xian smiled slightly and changed the topic. He warned, however, not many people know about this matter, so don't spread it. I know. Yi Ling'er was slightly surprised. What did that old man go to Jiangnan for? Now it was Fan Xian's turn to be surprised. No matter what, your great-uncle is a great-grandmaster. You just call him that? Yi Ling'er pursed her lips and said, he hangs around outside every year. Occasionally, he comes home without bringing anything good. I call him old man. What objection could he have? Fan Xian smiled. Through Yi Ling'er's words, he confirmed the closeness between Yi Luyun and the Yi family. Although Yi Luyun traveled the world in name, he certainly returned home many times. Otherwise, the young Yi Ling'er would not call him so intimately. After you married, did you throw away your martial arts? Fan Xian asked quietly. Yi Ling'er chuckled. She didn't know whether or not her teacher was preparing to test her. But under the current circumstances, Fan Xian still didn't keep his distance to avoid her. This put her in a good mood, and her eyes shone with eagerness. Fan Xian pretended not to see this expression. He minded his own business and left the lonely winter tree, walking toward the side of the lake in front. The two of them had already made a large circle and arrived at the other corner of the cold lake. They could faintly see a corner of the flower hall not far away hidden by the winter tree. With a swoosh, a gust of cold wind came from behind him. It quickly and sinisterly stabbed toward the back of Fan Xian's ear. Fan Xian did not turn his head. He shrugged his right shoulder. The tyrannical zhenqi in his body flowed along the increasingly wide meridians and surged into his right arm. It urged his right arm to naturally struggle. He waved his palm backward. His 5 slender fingers became 5 broken branches. They transformed into a number of afterimages. With incomparable speed and clarity, they tapped on the gust of cold wind behind his head. With a series of crisp smacking sounds, the object in the gust of cold wind was knocked down for no reason. However, Yi Ling'er's reaction was very fast. She threw a punch straight toward the back of Fan Xian's head. Fan Xian did not dare to be careless. With a turn of his toes, his entire body spun around. His palms naturally flipped and blocked in front of him. It was as if 2 large doors had suddenly been erected in front of him, completely blocking the wind from Yi Ling'er's fist. Immediately after, his feet paused. His knees bent slightly, and he forcefully twisted the noiseless kick from below. With a series of thuds, the battle was declared to be over. Fan Xian and Yi Ling'er stood by the lakeside. Their fists and palms intersected. Their legs were also locked together. This posture looked somewhat ambiguous. Fan Xian felt the bouncing sensation from the side of his knees. Very naturally, his heart swayed slightly, and a few other feelings arose. He coughed and separated from Yi Ling'er. He smiled and said, "Still too slow." Yi Ling'er unwillingly withdrew her unsheathed knife and said, "That's because you were too fast." Fan Xian's gaze unintentionally lowered. He looked at the cute embroidered cotton boots on Yi Ling'er's feet. He imagined that if he had moved a little slower earlier, that little foot would have kicked his lower abdomen. Presumably, it would not have felt good. In the future, don't use this kind of trick. It will ruin your future generations, he teased. Yi Ling'er huffed and said, "Master said that the so-called little tricks are just the 3 words shameless. No wonder this kick didn't hit you. Only now do I understand. You like to use these kinds of sinister tricks. Of course, you can guess my next step." Fan Xian was speechless. When the two of them had fought earlier, Yi Ling'er had used Fan Xian's little tricks. What Fan Xian had used was the Yi family's coffin breaker, the simplified version of Great Grandmaster Ye's flowing cloud sandsho. Although Yi Linger was a rare 7th-level ace among women, in front of him, she had no room to show off. Yi Linger suddenly asked in confusion, "Master, although that stab from behind was a feint, why did you dare to use Sanzhou to directly deflect it?" Fan Xian glanced at her and laughed unhappily. "Since it was a test, of course you wouldn't use any poisoned weapons. What was I afraid of? Also, your little tricks weren't vicious enough. In the end, your fists and palms were restrained, and the hairpin on your head could also be used to kill people." Yi Linger glared at him. "Then wouldn't it all be gone? This is the great prince's manner. Where am I going to find a servant girl to comb my hair?" Fan Xian laughed loudly and said, "Then there's still a mouth left, that can bite people. Is my master a big dog?" Yi Linger was a little angry. "As a master, don't you know how to be a little more lenient?" Fan Xian looked at the stubborn girl, and couldn't help but think of 2 years ago on the streets of the capital, when he had broken her nose with his fist and made her squat on the ground crying. He laughed happily. After a moment, he suddenly opened his mouth. "In the future, don't call me master. Although I have no objections, you are, after all, a princess." The matter of Yi Linger and Fan Xian calling each other master and disciple was, in fact, well known to all the nobles in the capital. They treated it as child's play, and didn't pay it much attention. Even Yi Zhong himself had never raised any objections. But now that the situation had changed, and Yi Linger's status was even more noble, Fan Xian's suggestion was a matter of course. Yi Linger didn't like it, and said in a huff, "So what if I call you master? If that doesn't work, then you can call me master. In any case, the Yi family Sanzhou cannot be taught to outsiders." Fan Xian stopped and smiled bitterly. He knew that Yi Linger was speaking the truth. He had learned the coffin breaker from her, and he had truly taken advantage of her. He couldn't say anything more to distance himself from her. The two of them walked along the lakeside. Ever since Yi Linger had become a princess, she had never had the opportunity to go out in public and fight with others for fun. Today, she had occasionally fought with her master. Although it was only for a moment, she was still unusually excited. With great difficulty, she calmed her emotions. After a moment, she suddenly said, "Master, my father has also returned to the capital." Fan Xian was startled. He understood what she was reminding him of. "The people in the old military all hate you now." Yi Linger looked at him with a not quite there smile. Fan Xian shook his head and smiled bitterly. No matter how valiant his power was, as long as the military still stood against him and the Yi and Qin families were still alive, he would not be able to deal a fundamental blow to the second prince. He would also not be able to completely eliminate the second prince's strong desire to take the throne. Yi Zhong had only returned to the capital to report on his duties, but he, as well as Yi Luyun behind him, had already become the second prince's pillars because of his relationship with Yi Linger. "It's not easy to stop for a few days. I don't want to hear any more bad news from your mouth." Yi Linger was silent for a moment and then said seriously, "Master, no matter what, I am still a lady of the Yi family. I will stand on my father's and his side." Fan Xian paused and thought for a long time. He then said very seriously, "That is something that should be done. Believe me, I am speaking from the bottom of my heart." A glimmer of sadness appeared in Yi Linger's eyes. She knew that Fan Xian's words came from the bottom of his heart. She also knew that it was difficult for their positions to soften. You see, the ice on the surface of the lake will eventually melt. Fan Xian suddenly smiled and said, "Who says the matters of this world are so certain?" Yi Linger's face broke into a smile. Her eyes emitted a clear and joyful light like jade. She nodded her head heavily. Not far across the lake was the flower hall with its windows open. It could be seen that a few people were chatting inside. Fan Xian pointed in that direction and teased Yi Linger beside him, we are strolling on this side of the lake, it is really not proper. If the people in the pavilion saw us, who knows what they would say. Although the customs of the Qin kingdom were open, it was not appropriate for men and women to be alone. Yi Ling'er looked slightly embarrassed. Fan Xian continued to tease her. Do you think the second prince is already exploding with anger? And he still has to maintain that shy and calm smile on his face? Don't forget, you also smile like a ghost every day. Yi Ling'er was angry. Also, think about what Wan'er is thinking. Wan'er is a good person. Fan Xian sighed. She always urges me to find a few sisters to accompany her. After these words came out, Fan Xian cursed in his heart. This teasing had already exceeded the limits between teacher and disciple. Other than the ambiguity, there was also a bit of impetuousness. She was no longer the virgin girl of the past. She was a Wangfei who was already married. As expected, Yi Ling'er paused for a moment before understanding what he was saying. After her shock, she became angry. She clenched her fist and hammered it toward his head. Fan Xian knew that his habitual hooligan habits had flared up. He felt very ashamed. He did not dare to fight back. Turning into a stray dog, he ran along the side of the lake in a panic, wanting to hide in the flower hall. In the flower hall, the narrow window that was half the height of a person was open. The cold wind from the lake blew in, but it was turned into a fresh and pleasant spring air by the warm cage. The men and women of the royal family in the hall were chatting about interesting things from their childhood. Later, someone rushed to notice the man and woman on the other side of the lake. The great Wangfei smiled slightly and said, "Look, what are they doing?" The great prince raised his gaze and looked over. His expression changed slightly. Shortly after, he smiled and explained, "That kid has always considered himself to be Ling'er's teacher. I'm afraid he's teaching someone a lesson again." The great Wangfei smiled and glanced at the second prince's expression out of the corner of her eye. Li Hongcheng was holding a cup of wine. Drunkenly, he moved closer to the window and saw the scene of Fan Xian and Yi Ling'er standing and talking by the lake. He couldn't help but smile and say, "These two are both barbarians. Don't look at how nice they are talking at this time. Who knows, they might start fighting in a moment." Wuxia also moved closer to look with interest. She said enviously, "I also want to learn martial arts from Brother Xian, but he won't let me. How unfair." Everyone in the flower hall was looking at the young man and woman on the other side of the lake. Only the second prince and Lin Wan'er were together eating desserts and talking quietly. It seemed that they did not care at all what was happening over there. The great Wangfei turned her head to look at this scene. She couldn't help but have a strange feeling in her heart. Did these two not have any thoughts? The great prince looked at the other side of the lake and shook his head. In a low voice, he said, "The girl of the Yi family is married, but she still likes to cause trouble everywhere. Second prince, you have to control her in the manner. This Fan Xian is also too much." He didn't like it, but he didn't want to say much. The second prince was squatting on a chair and slowly chewing on an osmanthus cake. He said indistinctly, "What is there to control? After being cooped up in the manor for a year, this girl has gone crazy from wanting to beat people up. Fan Xian is just right here to be a sandbag, so I won't be taken advantage of in the manor." Beside him, Lin Wan'er nodded and said, "Two adults, yet they are born with childish tempers. When do they not end up fighting each other when they meet? Don't worry about them. Let them fight. In a moment, they will fight back." Hearing these words, the great prince and his wife looked at each other and thought, what kind of explanation was this? After the words were spoken, everyone turned their heads to look again. They saw that a fight had indeed broken out on the other side of the lake. Yi Ling'er had her fists clenched and was chasing Fan Xian as he fled wretchedly. The great prince couldn't help but smile. He thought that the son of heaven's family could actually have the noisiness and fun of a normal family. Having Fan Xian and Yilinger, these two unconventional people, was not necessarily a bad thing. The fighting became boring after watching for a while. Everyone returned to their conversation. The second prince accepted the handkerchief Wanner handed him and carelessly wiped his hands. Suddenly, he asked with great interest, "Princess, I have always been curious. The emperor of your country, just what kind of person is he?" Fan Xian was not the only one who thought carefully. It was clear that the great Wang Fei also liked being called the second prince's brother. She smiled slightly and said a few words. When Fan Xian fled wretchedly back to the flower hall, the great Wang Fei was talking about the interesting stories of the northern Qi emperor. Her words traveled out the door and startled him. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.